Mic is on. Great. My name is Kalen McGee. I'm a facilitator of the Local Government Working Group. I'll do a quick agenda review so that we can get right into the discussion. The working group has been working for the last, since 2019, on scaled and phased approaches, and the explicit goal of the working group is to work for local flexibility but statewide consistency in order to achieve successful updates of local coastal programs. So that's been the focus of this group, and that's the focus of today's discussion. For the agenda, we're going to start with members of the Local Government Working Group who will talk about the background of our work and what we've been doing. That will include Director Hucklebridge and an opportunity for the commissioners on the working group to give any opening comments that they want. After that, commission staff will give us an overview of the latest work product, Neighborhood Scale Approaches, which again is a strategy aimed at facilitating the inclusion of sea level rise and adaptation planning in local coastal programs and making for successful updates. Then, to add a little bit of context, some information from the field. Dr. Charles Lester talking about the Beach Resiliency Plan project, as well as stories from two coastal jurisdictions, Santa Cruz County and the city of Arcata, to talk about their experiences working with phased and scaled approaches. And then intentionally, we wanted public comment to be in the middle of this discussion so that there can be a discussion afterwards between the working group and commissioners and among commissioners with the information available that comes from public comment. So that's the flow for today. Thank you for your time and attention. And the first local working group member I'd like to point to is Supervisor Bruce Gibson from San Luis Obispo.
Thank you, Kalen, and Commissioner, Madam Chair, and Commission. It's always a great pleasure to be here. I was reflecting this morning that it's been 5 years now that the working group has been in action, and that's two words. We have had tremendous discussions on a wide variety of issues, ably facilitated by Mr. Kalen McGee. I can't say enough about his contributions to our abilities, along with his colleague, Ms. Megan Wiley, who's not with us today. We're taking on a big idea, and I think you're familiar with the way we've wrestled with this, especially since 2023, that adapting to sea level rise is going to be a mammoth undertaking. And as we look at how we do that, we've come to understand that we think there's reason to expand our thinking both in the scale of time and in the spatial scale as well. That it's going to be daunting to try to take care of every possibility of sea level rise at a certain time. So we need to phase our approaches, we need to phase our planning, and we need to phase our adaptation projects. And the item before us today is really talking about the expansion in spatial scale. That we'll talk a lot about what it means to be a neighborhood, but the net idea there is that if we do this right and are attending to the issues that we need to be attending to, we should be able to create the best possible outcome as we adapt to the changes that are coming with sea level rise. We know that these changes are potentially going to be harmful to our concept of what it means to manage the California coast. But our view is that there is that we're going to seek the best, and that is, I think, our responsibility both at the local jurisdiction level and and as we talk about this at the state level. And finally, in the last year, what the working group has specifically tried to do is broaden the conversation. As we've rolled this idea out, we have heard concerns voiced, and that you'll hear many of them today. I'm glad to hear those concerns. I'm fully optimistic that those concerns can be addressed. And if we work at it and come to this question with the trust that the working group has developed, I think we're going to see a great outcome. I've never been criticized for speaking for too short a time, and so I will at this point yield the floor. And I do believe next up is my supervisorial colleague from Ventura County.
We might get Supervisor Levere. For the moment, would love to go to Council Member and Mayor Pro Tem from Pacifica, Sue Beckmeyer.
Very good. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair Hart. Thank you, commissioners, for having us here. This is my third one of these meetings, and it's been a wild ride, and it continues to be. I'm joined by Eric Friedman, who is the former chair of the Coastal Cities Group of the League of Cities. I'm the current chair. And we really stand on the shoulders of the former chairs of that group, working with the local government working group through all the years. It's been a process of, as you said, Supervisor Gibson, building trust, building an opportunity to have conversations, to go, yes, but have you thought of this? And we spent this last year and a half doing a lot of listening sessions where we approached different jurisdictions, counties, cities, city managers, planners, all different sides of the point of view, the Surfrider Foundation, Smart Coast California. And we were gathering input and information and points of view. They didn't surprise us always. We kind of knew a lot of what we were going to hear, and we continue to hear it. And the broader and the wider this conversation goes, the more we'll hear. But that's the way we solve problems, and that's the way we get the items and the issues out on the table. So I'm not going to speak too much longer than that to say I'm really honored to be here and honored to be doing this work. Eric has a couple of comments.
Great. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Chair Hart and the Commission for hosting the working group meeting today. It's very important for us to continue that dialogue, and I want to thank Executive Director Hucklebridge and your staff for continuing to put the resources into this working group that's been for over 5 years now. And this is my third time also attending these workshops, and they've been very productive, and it's a good chance for the Commission to hear from the local government representatives, but also for us to hear from you in that spirit of collaboration on trying to really improve the coastal processes that will lead to better outcomes in the long range. And just at a high level with the neighborhood approach, it's important that we all understand and we all are in agreement on the two primary issues. Is everyone in this room and everybody watching is supportive of coastal access, not only just maintaining, but if we can expand it and ensuring that it's available for the generations to come, and also coastal protection. And that's where this working group has really tried to find common ground of how to get those policies together. And it's important to recognize that. And then for me, it's exciting to be here as part of the Coastal Commission and meeting and just really have this opportunity. The neighborhood to scale approach is at a general level, it's really looking to expand opportunities and some of the tools in the toolbox to really holistically look at how do we do coastal planning and adaptation in the future, rather than a parcel by parcel basis. When you're just doing individual parcels, you miss out and you can actually have worse outcomes because you're not looking holistically at a project. And an example I could give is 20 years ago when I was first getting started in public policy was actually with the Santa Barbara chapter of the Surfrider Foundation. And we were battling a golf course going in on the Gaviota coast. And part of the tools we use within the Coastal Act and within state policies was you actually are not supposed to look at an individual parcel. You need to look at the cumulative effects of all the development that could take place, whether it's through an EIR process or not. And so that's what the neighborhood approach in general is looking at. And what I want to wrap up with is to really appreciate the comments that are in the report today from those who raise significant questions and concerns about this approach. And those are critical for us because right now it's a general concept. And our task is to say, do we want to continue to explore the potential benefits of this? But the only way it's going to work is if we address all those questions and the feedback that we have and make it more specific. And there's a reason it's not specific today is because we haven't had the direction from the Coastal Commission, but we also wanted to hear what the specific questions and concerns from the public and the interest groups are. So that's why this discussion today is going to really inform us where we go from here, and appreciate your time in working with all of you today. Thank you.
Director Hucklebridge.
Thank you. And thank you, all of you, for being here today and for your collaboration over the last 5 or more years. It's, I think, a testament we're all here having this discussion about, this is hard work that we're all doing, and it has taken time to build trust and get to a place where we can start to find areas of agreement and where we can move forward and push this planning forward in a way that's successful for Californians. And so I just, appreciate all the participation from you all today and in the past. It's been really, it's been transformative, I think. So I think some of my comments, I think, will really echo a lot of what Eric said. I think just to talk a little bit about the context of why we're here, I think this commission, our local government partners, the members here of the public, we're all very well aware of the threat of sea level rise and the dire need to do adaptation and planning for our coastline. I don't think that's in question. But what we're trying to do is find an approach that we can work on together that will be successful. This commission is often looking at that type of planning and adaptation on a parcel by parcel scale. And I think we can all agree that that is not really successful. It's not a recipe for success when you're looking at resources that exist on a much larger scale than a parcel. It's hard to talk about beach access when you're looking at a very narrow place. We have to be thinking really more expansively about how are we ensuring public access to our coast for all those Californians and visitors to California that deserve it and that have a right to it. So parcel by parcel, I think, also often amplifies the voices of the privileged. It's the folks that have the resources to own property on the coast. And so if we're really serious about centering this discussion on the voices and perspectives of EJ communities, tribes, and other folks that don't historically haven't had that voice in this process, I think we need to take a broader perspective and open that up a little bit to think on a little bit larger scale. I took to heart very much Commissioner Escalante's comments from this morning about, we have these increasing climate impacts, we have people that are trying to flee heat and fire and other things, and often will end up on the coast. Very narrow strip with a lot of people that need to be there. And how are we going to provide for that? And I think if we're focused in on these little parcels, we're not thinking in the right scale. So I think that's a lot of, at least why from a commission's perspective, commission staff perspective, we're coming to this discussion today and appreciate the partnership of our local governments who also maybe have a slightly smaller scale than we think of sometimes, but a very similar approach. How do they get their communities, whether it's public access or protection of resources, how are they doing that for their community on a scale that is really meaningful and will actually ensure that those resources are available to us in the future? And the result of some of the parcel by parcel, I think, is, the result of where we are now is sort of this hurdle to getting LCP planning done. This is a difficult discussion. There are a lot of issues to dig into here, but just the practical result is that we got to a place, like kind of a log jam of being able to get LCP planning around sea level rise and other climate adaptations moving forward. And I think what this conversation today is an attempt by the local government working group to break through that log jam, to start trying to have a meaningful discussion about how we do this work, and lean into the discomfort a little bit. So I also want to be pretty clear, at least from my perspective, about the purpose of today's workshop. Our hope today is for a robust discussion about the potential benefits as well as the challenges and concerns related to the approach we'll be presenting today. The local government working group is not seeking an endorsement per se of this approach. That's not the goal of today. It's to get your feedback. What do you think about it? What are the concerns you have? How should we move forward? And what does that look like? And we're looking for your feedback, and we are absolutely looking for the feedback of the public and of all of our, all the folks here today, but even more broadly than that. This is not, a one and done discussion. This is sort of a very, a first step of a much broader discussion we're going to need to have over many years. So second, I do want to acknowledge that the approach, as you I'm sure have seen, is fairly broad. It's not very specific, and that was by design. We wanted to have a conversation about the concepts presented in this approach as that first step, as I said before. We will obviously need to build more specificity and start thinking through how to do that. And we look forward to hearing from you all about how we should approach that. But, and I do imagine it's going to be very tempting to start focusing in on this particular jurisdiction or this challenge we're having in this part of the coast. And I would just urge us all to try to resist that temptation and do try to kind of have a more broad discussion. Next, I just wanted to say how appreciative I am of all the insights from all the public comments we've received, the input over the years, from our local government partners, from our NGO partners, from members of the public, just the whole gamut. It is a critical component of this. We welcome all of that input, and we look forward to hearing from more today. Again, this is expected to be a robust discussion. We want nothing less. I'm especially appreciative of the letter we got from the group of NGOs. They made some excellent points and raised some really important concerns that we completely agree with from a commission staff and I would imagine a local government working group perspective. Those are exactly the types of concerns we want to be thinking through. Okay, well, how are we going to address this? How do we move forward with this approach to ensure that we are being responsible in how we're planning for sea level rise and protective of the resources that we all know and love. But I do want to be very clear from a commission perspective that any approach or concept or eventual guidance or action that this commission takes will be consistent with the Coastal Act. We're not looking to make changes or suggesting or supporting, frankly, any changes to the Coastal Act. We believe that this can all be done within the frame and the protective frame of the Coastal Act, and it must be there. So we're not, we want to be very clear about that. This is not meant to be a loophole of some kind. We really want to get through some of these challenges and figure out how to do that in a way that is, it speaks to both the intent and the specific policies of the Coastal Act. So I think it probably makes sense to move on to the discussion. I did again want to just acknowledge that some of the concepts and things we're talking about are uncomfortable. There's some disagreements, and that is okay. And I think we need to lean into that and talk through it as we have in the local government working group for several years and have made progress towards that front. And so I just, I think we're going to have to get uncomfortable. This is a hard thing to figure out. It's scary, but if we want again to protect the beaches and the coastal resources, the coastal communities that make California unique, we have to figure this out. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Kaylin.
Thank you. Just before we turn to the concept paper, which outlines this approach, I want to make room for the two commissioners that serve on the local government working group, Commissioners Wilson and Harmon, if there's anything they want to add.
Okay. As Commissioner Harmon has said before, we like to use this term. I like to associate myself with all the comments that have been made here today. Speaking for Commissioner Harmon and myself, we're a lot of gratitude for the work that's been done by everyone in this committee and or in the working group and the staff. To get us this far. Yes, there is an inherent tension between the Coastal Act and local government. It's been there since the beginning. As a matter of fact, the act was created out of that cauldron. But it's only been made more complicated by adding, as Supervisor Gibson said, the time and spatial elements that sea level rise brings to this equation. And so that's what makes this inherently more difficult to deal with. I want to thank the commission for engaging this on an annual basis and for these updates. And I want to really thank the local governments that are coming to us and seeing that there's a lot of discussion around the flexibility, the insights, the creativity, the ingenuity that local governments are bringing to the table because they have their own interests in their own ideas. And we are looking for alignment in those spaces where we can find it. And I think there are a lot of opportunities for that. And so thank you to everybody who's working diligently to get us there. So that's all I've got to say for now.
Thank you, and thank you, Commissioner Wilson. I'll just add very briefly, I'm new to this group, and in the last 6+ months, my schedule has been very much dictated by baby Andrew more than meetings. So take this with a grain of salt. But I did want to say, and it really came up in all the opening comments that we had, as someone personally who straddles the sometimes challenging line between a local government representative and a member of the Coastal Act who is tasked, obligated, and honored to effectuate the Coastal Act in our state, that's a real challenge. And to see the work that this group has done and to come into it late, you know, I really sort of jumped in after you had done a lot of the hard work of moving this forward, but to hear the respect and commitment with which you all are having those conversations, to me, as much as the work that we do month after month is ensuring the future of the Coastal Act for our whole state, so too are the conversations that you are having and that we intend to have today. So I had to add to what Commissioner Wilson said, especially as someone who's sort of floating around the outside of this for now, but intends to be more involved. I really am grateful for the work that you do, and particularly Councilmember Friedman for always keeping me updated on what happened in the last meeting. So every Tuesday he tells me what's been discussed, so I really appreciate it.
All of the products of the working group come from not only the working group members, but on the working group are staff from the commission, as well as from local jurisdictions, as well as CSAC, as well as Cal Cities. And however, there's someone that's really key for the synthesis of these ideas, and that's Kelsey Ducklow, who can give us an overview of the concept paper that is describing the nature and the goals of this approach.
All right, thanks everyone. And I do have, well, I have 2 PowerPoints, but the one that's labeled number 1 hopefully should be the first one. Thank you. And you can skip ahead to the next slide, second slide. No worries. I'll just go ahead and start. So, you know, just to quickly set the stage and sort of lay out how we got here today. We've heard a little bit already. Skip to slide 2. Over the past several years, the efforts of the local government working group have helped to open conversations, improve coordination, and lay a foundation for LCP updates that address sea level rise. But a variety of challenges still remain, which have slowed or stalled many LCP update efforts. For the past 2 years, the local government working group has worked to better understand these policy conflicts and other challenges that are facing communities as they attempt to update their LCPs, and developing a possible approach for addressing some of these challenges. In January 2023, the working group held a stakeholder workshop to introduce and discuss the concept of neighborhood scale adaptation, which is meant to move beyond a sort of reactive parcel by parcel approach, which I'll discuss more in just a minute, and as you've sort of heard already introduced today. Following the workshop, the group held a series of interviews with local governments to gather additional feedback. And following that outreach, the working group developed a draft concept paper that was shared with stakeholders, including through a targeted listening session held in June. And that draft concept paper is currently available as an exhibit to the staff report for this item. Next slide. The purpose of the paper is to provide something for stakeholders to respond to and to really move out of the more hypothetical conceptual stage the working group had been in into something more tangible that folks can really reflect on, consider what this approach is and what it would entail to implement it. I want to be clear that at this point in time, the paper is meant for discussion purposes only, and we expect to refine the concepts in it following this workshop. This is not something that is meant to be adopted by the Commission in this form, and certainly not at this time, but rather, again, to provide something tangible for the Commission and other stakeholders to reflect on and respond to. The box on the left-hand side, it is the right-hand side of the slide, summarizes the contents of the draft paper. It includes a background on the local government working group work to date, a summary of the stakeholder feedback we received from the workshop and interviews regarding the challenges associated with sea level rise planning, an introduction to neighborhood scale approach and discussion of the opportunities the working group thinks it provides for overcoming a lot of those cited challenges, and a brief introduction to the types of LCP components such an approach would entail. Next slide. Diving in a bit more, we want to touch on the challenges that we heard from stakeholders because these really set the stage for understanding where we are with LCP updates and why that is. This slide shows the key topic areas we heard discussed, and though we have them listed out as distinct issues, really they all interrelate with the implications of one topic feeding into and driving the concerns of another, as I'll touch on. Next slide. One category of challenges and concerns we have heard relate to policy and legal issues, a primary one being conflicting interpretations of the definition of existing structure as it relates to Section 30235 of the Coastal Act, which has important implications for when shoreline protection is approvable. And really, this is an issue that has been a major impetus for the working group's efforts over the past several years. In short, the Commission's interpretation of this term is existing at the time the Coastal Act became effective in 1977, while other interpretations include existing at the time of a permit application or an LCP certification. This disagreement has resulted in a variety of stalled or abandoned LCP updates, with many citing a desire to wait for a judicial ruling or regulatory or legislative changes prior to moving forward. At the same time, there have been some LCP certification success stories. These have used either the Commission's interpretation or remained silent on the question. And it is important to note that the existing in the context of 30235 relates to a specific scenario in which armoring is permissible, but is not the only scenario in which the Commission has allowed armoring. Relatedly, a variety of legal concerns, particularly surrounding property rights and the potential for takings claims, were also cited by many stakeholders. A focus of these concerns tends to be on policies that would prohibit or limit shoreline armoring, or which would require managed retreat or relocation, or which are perceived to require such actions. However, a wider variety of sea level rise planning activities, such as completing hazards mapping and vulnerability assessments, requiring general or specific future adaptation actions, and requiring disclosure of sea level rise related hazards have also raised takings concerns. While there are a variety of legal doctrines and case-specific factors that can reduce the risk of takings claims, these situations are so fact-intensive and context-specific that even the threat of such claims can make local governments unwilling to pursue certain approaches or LCP updates that touch on sea level rise. Next slide. The next category of challenges we heard all relate to the appropriate scales of adaptation approaches and how they are implemented. A longtime concern regarding sea level rise adaptation planning has been the need for flexibility to address local contexts and goals and to avoid one-size-fits-all approaches. What works on an urbanized beach in LA will necessarily be different than what works on a more rural coastline in Del Norte. I also want to note that this doesn't just operate solely at the statewide level. Just as we don't expect there to be a single strategy used throughout the whole of California, nor should we expect that there will be a single strategy that fits an entire county or city coastline. A related issue is that the current status of planning is such that most adaptation actions are implemented on a parcel-by-parcel basis, and without a shift towards more holistic planning, there is no reason to expect that to change. Without that sort of proactive planning, though, individual property owners are left to their own devices for protecting their own property, often turning to armoring where allowable, as a variety of softer or nature-based strategies are infeasible at a parcel scale. What we have and will continue to end up with then is this patchwork of development with different entitlements to armoring, a mix of armoring and other adaptation strategies, and an inability to effectively mitigate impacts and protect coastal resources now and into the future. At the same time, the seeming infeasibility of wide-scale adaptation strategies, specifically but not exclusively including managed retreat, is a challenge cited by many. The funding needs, along with the cross-property planning and coordination that is often needed for these strategies, can stop them from even being evaluated, or where specific projects are further along, legal challenges can add to the time, complexity, funding, and other resources needed to carry out implementation. Next slide. The last major category of challenges I'll touch on relates to uncertainty in a variety of forms. First, a lack of certainty about outcomes has been highlighted by various stakeholders as both a reason for reluctance to complete LCP updates and a consequence of the lack of LCP updates. In short, there are concerns that updates to LCPs may potentially weaken certain protections or limit important adaptation options. For property owners, concerns about limits on armoring. For others, concerns about allowing armoring to the detriment of beaches and coastal resources. Yet, as I touched on earlier, the working group would also contend that the status quo isn't better for coastal resource outcomes. The other main area of uncertainty pertains to sea level rise science itself. Many stakeholders continue to have questions about how to address and plan for sea level rise, and subsequently develop adaptation or appropriate LCP policies when there is uncertainty regarding exactly how much sea level rise to expect over different timescales. Specifically, there are questions about how precautionary planning exercises and actual project designs should be, and how to craft strategies and policy language that can be implemented in the near term, allow for phasing over time, ensure long-term protection of resources, and so on. I also want to note that this uncertainty and the other challenges I have mentioned are exacerbated by a variety of communication, education, and outreach challenges. A lack of understanding about sea level rise science, impacts, and trade-offs associated with different adaptation options, a lack of clarity and understanding about the legal and regulatory landscape and what types of options are permissible, challenges communicating what certain LCP policies mean and what outcomes they would entail, and most generally, challenges gathering input from key stakeholders, particularly those who do not live right along the coast, can result in misperceptions, distrust, lack of buy-in, and conflict, which can all stall planning efforts. Next slide. Very quickly, we won't talk about this much today, but I would of course be remiss if I didn't mention that funding, staffing, expertise, time, and informational resources are things we all, Commission and local governments included, need more of to address sea level rise, and the working group will continue to advocate for these as well. Next slide. Switching gears to what we do about all of this, the local government working group has suggested that neighborhood scale adaptation is one approach that can help to overcome many of these challenges. This refers to the concept of identifying and developing adaptation strategies that are specific to defined areas or assets with shared characteristics, and developing LCP policies to support and implement a phased approach to adaptation over time as sea levels rise. I want to note here that we are using neighborhood as a general term without a precise definition to refer to any sub-area with shared geologic, land use, or other characteristics that make sense as a unit for focused adaptation planning. These could be different sizes, such as long stretch of rural coastline, a single beach, an area of development, a hydrologic or watershed unit, or a specific facility to reflect relevant planning features. We also want to be clear that the local government working group has primarily focused on this approach as a way of moving beyond the specific challenges related to disagreements about the definition of existing structure and the commonly held perception that this definition is the sole determinator for whether or not something is allowed armoring. Instead of arguing about a legal interpretation and waiting and hoping for a judicial or legislative answer, the local government working group suggests committed to doing the planning exercise to think about what adaptation strategies are appropriate and useful in specific contexts, and if that means armoring in some cases, how do we appropriately limit that approach, plan for phasing, mitigate impacts, prioritize softer solutions, and ensure balanced protection of coastal resources across the jurisdiction and over time as sea levels rise. Next slide. I also want to take a moment to note that the Commission does continue to approve armoring, including sometimes to protect structures that don't meet the Commission's interpretation of existing. Sometimes this is done through conflict resolution, for example, in a variety of instances for critical infrastructure like wastewater treatment plants, where damage to such structures could result in water quality impacts. In other instances, armoring has been approved fronting structures that are not existing, but whose direct neighbors have a right to armoring, like in the project shown here in Santa Cruz County. All of these instances can raise a variety of questions and concerns, like what are the cumulative impacts associated with each of these decisions? How can we plan, condition, and implement projects to avoid maladaptive approaches that will make communities less resilient over time? How much and what type of mitigation can fully address impacts associated with armoring? In the project shown on this slide, the Commission approved armoring fronting 3 homes, in part determining that the lateral access incorporated in the armoring represented a mitigation package that will substantially improve public access by providing a continuous, safe public access way across a larger stretch of the coast where no such meaningful access currently existed. Yet some commissioners and stakeholders raised the types of concerns I mentioned, wary in part because these problems are particularly difficult to solve on a project-by-project and parcel-by-parcel scale. Next slide. These are concerns that can, however, be addressed at a broader LCP planning scale with a neighborhood scale approach. The working group believes that such an approach would lead to more meaningful protection of coastal resources and more proactive balancing of competing resource needs. In short, in order to certify an LCP update that includes neighborhood scale strategies, the Commission would need to find that it is, on balance, protective of coastal resources. This would mean that if armoring is to be used in some manner, ensuring protection of coastal resources over time would necessarily require a combination of meaningful mitigation and use of additional alternative strategies elsewhere and in the future that ensure protection of beaches, wetlands, and other resources. The working group believes this would in turn help to re-emphasize the need to evaluate, identify, and implement alternative strategies. In addition to addressing some of the conflicts related to the definition of existing, the working group believes that a neighborhood scale approach can address a variety of other challenges I highlighted earlier. For example, by actually committing to these planning exercises, identifying an appropriate suite of adaptation strategies, and memorializing these in an LCP certification, we will have greater certainty regarding what strategies are appropriate and allowable, and how individual projects and strategies fit into and are consistent with an overarching plan to protect coastal resources now and into the future. Such an approach is also by nature a flexible approach that would specifically account for different geophysical factors, patterns of development, resource needs, local goals, statewide resource requirements, and so on. Lastly, this fits in with topics the working group has previously worked on, such as recommendations for phased and more routine LCP updates and regional approaches, as well as the types of planning requirements addressed in SB 272. Next slide. I also want to take this opportunity to note that this approach has been used before, and we have been working with a variety of local jurisdictions on this type of planning, even if we didn't call it that at the time. For example, the City of Morro Bay's LCP was approved as submitted and includes varied approaches that reflect the contexts of both the largely armored or managed shoreline within the estuary, much of which includes coastal dependent or related working waterfront and visitor serving uses, as well as in the more natural open coast shoreline. This isn't to say that these are easy to do, and coming up next, we'll hear from 2 local governments who are working on LCP updates to better address sea level rise and some of the questions that have arisen in their planning processes. Next slide. A key set of questions we have heard more recently relates to how a neighborhood scale approach would be incorporated into an LCP. The last section of the draft concept paper introduces a discussion of the types of LCP components that a neighborhood scale LCP would likely entail. We want to caution that this discussion is a key area where we intend to provide additional detail in the future, and as such should not be considered an exhaustive list right now, but rather to provide some insight into what we've been thinking. Generally, we see such an update as including baseline sea level rise policies that apply to all areas or development, including requirements for best available science and risk disclosures, policies informed by a vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan, and a commitment to update and refine such studies, more detailed or refined policies that define an adaptation approach at a neighborhood-specific scale, and identified planning horizons and requirements for LCP updates. And as I've touched on already, we have noted a variety of factors that we think will be important to consider and include to ensure such an approach is consistent with the Coastal Act. These include considerations about the development context. For example, what is the mix of existing and post-Coastal Act development, infrastructure, open space, and so on, as well as shoreline characteristics. Are these areas that would support wider sandy beaches or rocky habitats? Other factors relate to a mix of adaptation strategies. Where can managed retreat, nature-based strategies, or elevation be used to limit armoring? How can and should strategies be phased over time, and what are the planning, monitoring, and policy update requirements needed to make sure these shifts happen? And lastly, how can the mix of strategies improve the status quo? What type of mitigation projects might be needed to fully and holistically address impacts from any continued armoring? The working group is particularly interested in gathering feedback today on these components of a neighborhood scale LCP update. Next slide. At this point, I'll be turning things back over to Kaylin.
Kelsey, thank you very much. We have one more section before public comment to add a little context. If there is a common denominator throughout all of these discussions, not just in the working group, but broadly, it's that the coast is changing. And so we've got some speakers to speak to the following points. First, that different beaches and different parts of the coast face different forces, and therefore will have different futures. And so to talk about the Beach Resiliency Plan project is Dr. Charles Lester. And after that, we want to hear from 2 local jurisdictions about their experiences looking for regional adaptation approaches, phased and scaled approaches, and the challenges involved with that, including having meaningful community discussions. But first, Dr. Lester, when you're ready.
Great. Well, the slides are coming up. It's great to be here again, twice in 2 months. Your staff asked if I would come and speak a little bit about the Beach Resiliency Plan in connection to neighborhood scale planning. And so I am going to talk a little bit about the Beach Resiliency Plan project and then segue into some observations from the field. I don't have stories, but So if you can expand that. I love the wave filter, by the way. The Beach Resiliency Plan is a OPC-funded project. I think I briefly mentioned it last month. And it's a grant coming to UC Santa Barbara, which I'll be leading with some other folks at Santa Barbara and some other people I'll talk about in a minute. But we have this opportunity to take a look at beach resiliency planning for the state. If you could go to the next slide. You hit the little icon in the lower right, just to the left of the corner, it'll expand it. Next, just to the left of the zoom bar. So, to the right of that one. The OPC has a strategic plan, which you may have received a presentation on, and in the past, one of their goals is to safeguard coastal and marine ecosystems and communities in the face of climate change. Under that goal, they have a specific objective to create a California beach resiliency plan, and that's what is being funded by this project. As scoped right now, it has three basic parts. One is to do county-level snapshots of California beaches. So we've got 20 beaches along the outer coast and with the Bay Area that have beaches of some sort that we're going to be taking these snapshots about. More on that in a minute. Then developing decision guidance and technical support for addressing beach resiliency, and statewide policy recommendations that might be useful for moving forward on this question. If you go to the next slide. The core research team, as I mentioned, UC Santa Barbara is leading it. We have a couple other folks at Santa Barbara, Jenny Dugan and Summer Gray, looking at environmental justice and beach ecology issues. A bunch of folks at CSU Channel Islands supporting. USGS is on the team, Point Blue Conservation Science, CETO Consulting, and Strategic Earth. So it's a really great group of researchers, exciting people who are looking at different aspects of this question. Next slide. And so the Beach Resiliency Plan specific components that I'll get into in more detail. Next slide and next slide. Components include an update to USGS's coastal storm modeling system, and this will be to couple beach erosion and response. So other duties as assigned to Kate. Habitat and biodiversity assessment, including rocky intertidal areas, and assessing the social dimensions of beaches, including beach use, access and recreation, coastal economy and tourism, social equity, tribal and cultural impacts. Next slide. So one of the great things about this project, I think, is we're taking an interdisciplinary approach, right? So all the team members that I reviewed a minute ago represent different disciplinary focuses on this question of what is a beach. So on the left-hand side of this slide, we've got the relationship between environmental and social factors, all of these things which go to this question of, well, what is a beach? And as my colleague Summer Gray will tell you, beaches are social constructions, right? How we think about them, how they unfold in front of us as social processes. So in the context of what you're talking about and climate change, the question is, well, what do we do about this? What is resiliency in the context of something called a beach, which is complex? The plan itself will have those three components underneath in the blue box, and that, as OPC is hoping will, and we're hoping too, will inform moving forward adaptation planning and action, in particularly meeting the goals of SB 1, SB 272, and your own LCP Grants Assistance Program. So that's the disciplinary structure of the research project, which will take 2 to 3 years. Next slide, please. So why does this matter to you? Well, I don't have to tell you that beaches are at the center of your activity from the very beginning, right? In 1972, Dennis the Menace was going out there and telling us that the beach was gone. And this was 50 years ago. So we know that beaches are important and central to your mission, to the objectives of the state. And we didn't use the word resiliency back then, but we did talk about the permanent protection of resources for present and future generations. You might call that resiliency. Next slide. And sea level rise itself is not really a new thing either. It's just an accelerating trend. And in 1971, the Army Corps told us that a vast portion of our coast was constantly being lost by the natural process of erosion. In 1977, we knew that there were problems up and down the coast, and the understatement of the decade, many problems still exist and new ones are likely to occur. Even back in 1962, one of the great coastal geologists, geomorphologists, Brun, said the seriousness of sea level rise with respect to erosion is demonstrated by the computed results. And then he talks about how much our beaches might recede with sea level rise. And this is my favorite quote from 1972. If you could go to the next slide, please. From the California Ocean Area Plan, under none other than Governor Ronald Reagan, beach erosion control. The state, local, and federal governments should actively explore non-structural alternatives to beach erosion control projects, including the purchasing of eroding lands. Would that be a buyback bill, maybe? Next slide. So your own funded work across the state, local governments are doing vulnerability assessments, is showing us that this is a real problem. So beaches are projected to disappear in many places. These are examples from Del Mar, City of Santa Cruz, Marin County, Huntington Beach, all showing the progressive loss of beaches with sea level rise. UCSB, you heard last month, has its own issues with how the shoreline is going to recede. So what does all this mean for neighborhood scale planning, neighborhood adaptation? I should point out, these are my observations. They aren't sponsored by OPC, for sure. And I'm not expressing the team's opinions either, since we haven't really started the project. So you've already heard, and I think Kelsey pretty much nailed it with the issues and how to talk about this issue. It's about context and diversity, and beaches are extremely diverse in our state. They are matched up with extremely diverse communities and built environments. So understanding that diversity is part of the challenge, and figuring out what to do in any particular context is the challenge while meeting the Coastal Act. We also have a lot of shared interests. These are all communities that we would call beach communities in California. They're different, yes, but they all have a similar challenge that you are struggling to address. Next slide. I guess I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. These are the shared beach communities. Next slide. I love that. So when we think about scale and solutions, what does it mean to take a neighborhood approach? Well, I think we need to think about solutions across a number of different scales. And so, you know, this is a growing field in Newport that you can see in the picture. It's obviously larger than a neighborhood, I think, maybe a couple neighborhoods. But the point is that solutions that we're talking about happen in different scales and different contexts and different conditions. Next slide. So I think we need to think about neighborhood scale as an entry point for multi-scale planning. And I think that's what you were saying, Kelsey, is adaptation happens at multiple geographic scales. All of these scales are important to figuring it out. We have to look at parcels, we have to look at neighborhoods, we have to look at communities, cities, counties. Littoral cells, I've been working with the folks at CSU Channel Islands planning for the Santa Barbara littoral cell. That's how sand moves. That's how beaches form and change. There's also a sand shed, the inland watershed of where does sand come from. So if we want to understand how to protect beaches, we need to understand how beaches work. That's not just at a neighborhood scale. And then that green blob you see there, that's what we identified as the access shed. This is where people live that are coming to the beaches that we're looking at. So if you want to plan for those, for beach access in those places, you need to understand that access shed. All of these different scales overlap, and they might express themselves at a neighborhood. So next slide. How you doing, Billy? LCPs, you've been doing LCP planning for 40-plus years. These are a planning mechanism that provide for the connectivity across scales, putting parcels in a planning frame. So that concept of doing planning, which would encompass the cumulative impacts of a build-out of a bunch of parcels, that's not news, right? That's planning. That's LCP planning. And that's what counties and cities have been doing for a long time. So next slide. Neighborhood scale can't only be about the immediate neighborhood or the front line of development. Your work over the years in the lower right, all those access easements that have been extracted over the years, that's on the front line of development, but you're not doing that for the front line, right? You're doing that for the state of California. It's a bigger than a neighborhood question. Next slide. And that really goes to, what are you trying to accomplish within a neighborhood? And that's to provide access for all, in part, especially when talking about beaches. And these are, the green and the yellow box are excerpts from the California Coastal Plan, which, as you know, set up the question of putting an affordable housing policy in the act. But I put them here because the Coastal Plan talked about affordable housing not as important for housing, although it also said that, but important for access. And that vision in the orange box was from the Coastal Plan. It said, well-maintained, older, less expensive housing that provides opportunities for people of all incomes to live near the ocean. So we thought about living near the ocean as access. That's how you make it equal, is you're able to live there. And of course, that became a focus on equality of affordable housing in the coastal zone and that policy. Excuse me. So what this does for me is highlights the broader social scale of what you need to think about when you're doing neighborhood scale work. Next slide. Another part of this project that's exciting is we will be looking at beaches as ancestral lands and sacred places, and this just highlights the critical importance of engaging with tribal communities in California and asking how do we express their needs and concerns and capture their interests also when we talk about beaches and beach resiliency and in relationship to all these other factors. Next slide. And then of course, it's not only about people, right? Beaches in California provide a lot of important ecological function. I assume most of you are familiar with Children's Pool, for better or worse, and the dynamics around that. Next slide. I went down to San Carlos Beach this morning before coming here just to see the local expression of marine mammals on the beaches, which is quite impressive, also pretty smelly. Next slide. So I had an opportunity to work with Ocean Sciences Trust Project looking at the intersection of equity and living shorelines, or the environmental dimension of adaptation strategies. And I think this is important for the neighborhood scale approach because it goes to context, but it also frames for us that any given intervention will have equity implications and ecological implications. And you could plot those on this 2x2 and ask, how equitable is it? How environmental or living is it? And ask yourself, are you meeting the targets or the right balance that you want between those things? Next slide. So neighborhoods, I think, can be places to find balance and make trade-offs. Next slide. But all these trade-offs are different again. In particular, we have a theme of the trade-off between housing, infrastructure, and resources or beaches, right? What's the right strategy there? Good luck with that. So next slide, please. We need to ask, particularly in the context of what I think you're going to hear next and you're going to be dealing with for many years, will every built environment become a beach sacrifice zone? We know that if sea level continues to rise and we harden the back of the shore, we're going to lose beaches. Next slide. But this is a particularly interesting question that is going to be asked by the OPC project. Will beaches disappear no matter what we do? So what's going to happen in all of these different places as sea level continues to rise? And it's really a geological question, technical question that USGS is going to look at. These are beaches at Santa Barbara, and even in that one campus, we have different kinds of beaches. We have the steep campus east beach, we have the dunes beach, and I'm much more optimistic about the dunes beach being able to survive sea level rise than I am that steep east beach environment. Next slide. We have great examples that you've seen a lot where we can see beaches be resilient, like at Fort Ord, where the revetment was put down over years. Next slide. And when we took it out, the beach nicely recovered. But that's because it's easily erodible, right? That particular area of the environment could recover. And I'm optimistic about that in the future with sea level rise. Next slide. We also know in contexts like lower bluffs at the Half Moon Bay Ritz, it could also continue to be resilient, particularly if the Coastal Commission intervenes and orders the revetment out. Next slide. And you can see the beach is recovered and continues to erode. So there are places where this happens. And if you go to the next slide, it's one of my favorite examples, Moss Beach in Montara. In the upper left, 1972, you can see a nice lateral beach in front of those parcels. In 2023, 2 houses on either side of the beach that you see there have been armored, but the beach has continued to persist where it's been able to erode. And that's what you see on the upper right is that shot of that beach. A great example of if you allow the beach to continue to persist through the erosion, natural erosion processes, maybe it will. So the question we're framing is, where are those places where this may or may not be more likely? Next slide. And last month, I talked a little bit about vision, and I want to put it back on the table again because I do think it's a really important thing to keep in mind for this neighborhood scale planning. This is the City of Monterey example called Window on the Bay. Decades ago, the city decided they wanted to convert this mixed commercial strip along Del Monte Avenue into an oceanfront public park. And through systematic focusing on willing sellers, buying up land, demolishing structures, they created that park. And so it's an example where they set out a vision for how to adapt a neighborhood. I think this is a neighborhood, right? How to change that neighborhood to a beachfront park. And they did it by working with the marketplace systematically. Next slide. Of course, now they have been in the middle of planning for that exact same area in the face of sea level rise. And in terms of visioning, they've framed, I don't know the exact status of this today, but a couple of years back, they framed these 2 alternatives. One, a seawall, and we know what happens there. The ocean is going to come up and we're going to lose the beach. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see a vision of another way we could adapt. Oh, back up. Oh, you blew the punchline, Billy. Next one up. Yeah, you have to go up about 2 slides. 3, 2. Up, other way. One more, and one more. Nope, other way. One more. There you go. City of Monterey, imagining a different approach at Del Monte, where they would let the ocean come in and adapt the shoreline to the ocean. And in that one box in the center, the green box says, hey, look at this. This alternative would create 2+ miles of more beach. All right, so we're creating a different beach environment, but it's a matter of what kind of adaptation alternative you select. Next slide. And so the question, which I think Kelsey also framed, is what are the pathways to get to these visions in each and every neighborhood? And this is an example from Ventura County for Hollywood Beach. And if you look closely at the details, you can't read it here really, but it's about a sequence of actions as sea level rise gets progressively higher. what are the actions or interventions you need to take in order to make sure Hollywood Beach continues to be Hollywood Beach, development continues to be safe. And so it's an iteration, an evolution of interventions over time and over decades. Next slide. So in the end, I think, and I'm not sure there's anything new here, but neighborhoods are places to integrate adaptation action. So you're not working at only a neighborhood scale, you're working in a neighborhood to bring things together. And those things are time, space, decision, action, and importantly, people. And that's why it's important to have all these different perspectives at the table, to bring them together, to understand how they relate, to define the context and what matters. And that means, for me anyway, planning needs to work across multiple geographic scales. You need strategies and actions to account for intergenerational timescales. Adaptation strategies need to put incremental action, or what's being called parcel-based action, in the context of a comprehensive plan. Integrating human dimensions, all the values, why we care about beaches, and putting decision processes in front and center to make them more inclusive and engaging with everybody, and iterative. So now you can go to the comic strip. Next slide. So I threw this back up because this was, back in the thick of the battle around the Geffen easement, which is now the Linda Laughlin easement, which is great. But it was expressing, Doonesbury was expressing a lot of, Zonker was expressing a lot of frustration that he thought he'd been out of the access battle. He thought David Geffen, had, been shut down, right? But no, it's not the case. And he says, mansion owners are now a law unto themselves. And he goes, damn, I thought that this was way settled, right? And he's not out of it. No, I thought I was out. Don't do this to me. And he says it's your destiny. And so I think that is your destiny, is that having a successful LCP planning process, even at a neighborhood scale or whatever scale, that's the beginning of successful adaptation over decades, right? So you need to think about this as the first step in getting to a place where you can keep the iterations going. Someone used to say, what, the coast is never saved, it's always being, yeah. Anyway, thank you very much for the time. Next slide.
Dr. Lester, thank you very much. We have two more pieces of context setting before we take a break and go to public comment, and then a discussion afterwards on this concept. First, please let me invite David Carlson from Santa Cruz County. Sir, when you're ready.
Okay, thank you, commissioners, for holding this workshop, and to your staff for the invitation to bring the County of Santa Cruz local government staff experience and perspective to the issue of neighborhood scale adaptation planning. And thank you. Okay, next slide. So the presentation will include some background on local LCP planning for coastal hazards in Santa Cruz, and take a look at coastal hazards that impact our coast. I'll show some types of neighborhood areas that characterize Santa Cruz coast, and finish up with some thoughts on adaptation planning locally. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, these are pictures of construction of an upper bluff retaining wall to protect existing development located just a few feet from the edge of the bluff and threatened by erosion. Our 2020 LCP amendment proposal addressing coastal hazards, including allowing armoring to protect existing development threatened by erosion, which maintained our existing policy approach in the urban area of the county. It also meant using the current definition of existing development in the county's LCP, shown here, and allowing new development to rely on existing armoring. Next slide. The commission denied that LCP amendment. The staff report described the policy conflicts with the Coastal Act and the over-reliance on armoring. Commissioners echoed these concerns and highlighted the importance of respecting the commission's definition of existing development. We were encouraged to take advantage of the LCP grants program, which we did. Also at the hearing, the executive director at the time recommended exploring a neighborhood scale approach and provided some guidance. While encouraging creativity and pushing the boundaries of the status quo, he cautioned that approach needs to have robust sideboards involving appropriate mitigation, development restrictions, and long-term adaptation planning. Next slide. In September 2023, the Coastal Commission awarded the county grant funds to complete a comprehensive sea level rise vulnerability assessment on the LCP amendment. The project will complete a series of technical studies on sea level rise hazards, economic impacts, and adaptation pathways, and that will culminate in an LCP amendment addressing coastal hazards. The project would build adaptation approaches at both the county-wide and neighborhood scale, including phased, trigger-based adaptation pathways. There will be a robust community engagement plan and ongoing coordination with Coastal Commission staff. And project staffs will be approached through a lens of equity and environmental justice, including outreach to historically marginalized groups, and consideration of the value of the coast as a low-cost recreational, social, and cultural resource in the economic analysis. The project's underway, and we just sent out invitations to join our community working group of about 15 to 20 community members to advise and help guide the project. Next slide. So switching gears here, I wanted to show just a few examples of the types of coastal hazards experienced in Santa Cruz County. The top left is Las Olas Drive near Seacliff State Beach, which is shown on the upper right. The bottom right is a piece of the Capitola Wharf inside of Zelda's restaurant in Capitola. The wharf is now rebuilt, and I think Zelda's repaired, and I think they incorporated that beam in the remodel of the restaurant. The bottom left is a house that probably was not well attached to its foundation piers, but nevertheless was picked up and pushed out into the middle of Beach Drive in the Seacliff area. So the county coastline experiences damaging storms on a fairly regular basis, and plenty of damage to armoring structures and houses occurs as a result of typical storms. The big ones depicted here in these photos result when heavy rain, storm surge, and high tides coincide to push the ocean more onshore than usual, damaging anything in its way. Next slide. And this is a picture from 1982 of the same Beach Drive area where a bluff failure knocked a house off its foundation into the middle of the road. Next slide. So this is a broad outline of the different regions making up the county coastline. Shoreline areas on the north coast are undeveloped except for a small cluster of houses at Davenport Landing. That's about halfway between the city of Santa Cruz and the San Mateo County line. The Mid-County Live Oak Beach area is a fully urbanized area between the cities of Santa Cruz and Capitola. And urban development continues south of the city of Capitola along the South County coastline before transitioning to mostly agricultural lands about halfway down that South County area indicated on the slide. The southern portion of the coastline in the county area does contain isolated clusters of housing development, and there's a cluster of houses and condos at the Pajaro Dunes development at the Pajaro River mouth near the Monterey County line, and I'll show a picture of that later. Next slide. So our north coast includes the town of Davenport on the upper left, 3 Mile Beach at the lower left, and Wilder Beach at the lower right. Next slide. The Mid-County Live Oak Beach area has a variety of neighborhoods, depending on how detailed you want to get. The two photos on the left show the avenues between the city of Santa Cruz and Pleasure Point. The upper left photo shows part of Twin Lake State Beach, where the state actually owns several undeveloped parcels at the end of 14th Avenue. Existing armoring in the avenues area is mostly revetments with some vertical retaining walls. The photo on the right is the Opal Cliffs area where the coastline changes direction and the bluffs are higher between Pleasure Point and the city of Capitola. The site of the upper bluff retaining wall I showed you in the earlier slide is pretty much right in the middle of that photo on the lower right. Armoring in the Pleasure Point and Opal Cliffs areas is a combination of modern tied back retaining walls like the one you saw in the earlier photo and older armoring of all kinds, including rubble and poured concrete, generally at the toe of the bluff. Next slide. The photos on the left show the Rio Del Mar and Beach Drive areas, with the upper left photo showing the area in the 2023 storms. Many of the properties on Beach Drive along the shoreline were impacted by storm surge, depositing sand and debris inside the homes, and bluff failure causing landsliding onto the homes. The photo on the right, lower right, is the Pajaro Dunes development. At the down coast end of that development is a sheet pile retaining wall to protect the condos from scour from the Pajaro River, and along the beach there's a buried revetment in the sand dune protecting that first row of houses. Next slide. And so this is the last slide, and so as described in the earlier slide, our vulnerability assessment will identify neighborhoods and analyze several alternative adaptation pathways for each neighborhood. The preferred pathways will include short, medium, and long-term strategies to achieve a vision such as the example vision on the right. Our baseline conditions are complex, however, and come into play differently for any given neighborhood or site. Designing short-term initial strategies and translating those strategies into updated policies in an LCP amendment that can be approved by both locally and by the Coastal Commission will not be an easy task, to say the least. As an initial strategy, for example, updating our development restrictions to be consistent with Coastal Commission guidance is controversial locally and statewide, as we know. Perhaps considering such development restrictions in the broader context of adaptation planning will help improve local acceptance of that strategy as an effective tool to achieve long-term vision for the coast as sea level rises. And another thought on development restrictions, there's a value to having certain types of overarching development restrictions along the coast that apply to all neighborhoods. A one-size-fits-all approach or a parcel-by-parcel approach is not necessarily something we should dismiss or seek alternatives to. I can tell you planners prefer a consistent set of regulations that apply equally to all individual applications as a matter of fairness. It's an effective tool in adaptation planning too. A consistent methodology for calculating a bluff setback, for example, results in structural setbacks appropriate for a given area, ensuring equal protection from erosion across all neighborhoods. And then one final thought. At the hearing in 2022, when the Commission denied our previous attempt to update our coastal hazard policies, we were advised on what we think we can realistically achieve in an LCP amendment and not try to solve all the issues at once. And I definitely tend to heed that advice. That concludes my presentation. Thank you for the time.
Thank you very much. And traveling all the way from Arcata, please, Mr. David Loya from City of Arcata. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Hart, Commissioners, and Local Government Working Group. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. And I did see the gummy bears circulating, so I understand we're at the point in the meeting where we need a little sugar bump. So I'll try and be succinct. My name is David Loy. I'm the Director of Community Development for the City of Arcata, the ancestral lands of the Wee
Could you raise your mic just a bit so we can hear you a little better?
Absolutely. Is that better?
Just raise it all the way up to your,
All the
toward
way.
your
Okay, and I'll
mouth.
step a little closer. I'm going to get up close and personal.
That's great, thank you.
I'm the Director of Community Development for the City of Arcata, the ancestral lands of the Wiyot. I wanted to give you just a bit of background because I think it helps explain the approach that I've taken with our community and the engagement that we've done. I have degrees in botany and ecology. I work in housing, economic development, long-range planning, and I've been working on the city's adaptation planning for about 10 years now. The City of Arcata has been working on an update to its local coastal program, comprehensive update, literally since the 90s. And so I've been involved in the last 10 or so years and have a lot of familiarity with this. I think the conversations, the relationships with local staff, statewide staff, and the commission as a whole has only improved over the time that I've been working for the City of Arcata, and so I'm really encouraged by these improved relationships, and I'm more encouraged by the discussions in sea level rise that we've move beyond just the science, best available science, and we're taking into consideration the whole range of affected sectors. Next slide. I'm going to do a little bit of a skimming the pond here with the work that we've been doing over the last 10 years, literally hundreds of hours of public engagement. And I know some of this information is you have a very strong command of these details, but I just wanted to give you a sense for how our community has been digesting this information. So this is obviously recent Ocean Protection Council guidance on projections for sea level rise. Next. And the H++ scenario, which was a very conservative approach to planning for sea level rise, we now know there's a 0 chance of that occurring. And the reason I point this out is because when we approach sea level rise projections from the mindset of a hazard mitigation approach, and we take extreme conservative approaches to those, sometimes they don't result in the conclusions that work for our local jurisdiction. Next couple, please. For example, and these are within the 2100 timeframe, not the 2150 as shown here, but there's a less than 1% chance of the extreme projections. Next slide. Whereas there's a near certainty that we're going to have at least a foot of sea level rise up to 2 feet before 2150. The middle projection, I think there's one more on this one. Middle projection is projected to be 6 feet by 2150. Which is, quite a bit for the city of Arcata. And I neglected to put a context slide to show you where Arcata is. We're located on Wiggy or Humboldt Bay. We don't have beaches. We have really unique scenarios, and you'll see some of those images as we come through this projection, or through this slide. But the context for what sea level rise means for us is really different than the last two presentations. So next slide. So this is an image of what 6 feet of sea level rise would look like for Arcata. You can see going east to west there, Highway 255 or Samoa, and the big interchange for 101, which goes through the center of town. All of the blue, of course, is the maximum sea level extent at 6 feet of sea level rise. And that's pretty dramatic. If you can look into that neighborhood, you can see that the streets are covered in water. You can see the roofs sticking out of water. And so that would be a really dramatic result. Next slide. So I had never heard of this term neighborhood scale adaptation before. Kelsey reached out to me a couple of months ago and shared with me the draft document that's before you today. And what I found was that a lot of the concepts in there really resonated with the work that I've done with our community, with our council and planning commission. And so I'll adopt that framework, this neighborhood scale adaptation, for the purposes of this discussion. So looking here, we've got a neighborhood that is in that blue area. This is the exact same neighborhood where the roofs were poking out from the water. Next slide. Zooming into, we have kind of two sub-neighborhoods, and I appreciated what Dr. Lester said, the concept of neighborhood, we need to scale it appropriately, so I'm just going to use this framework, but we do have an area that's primarily residential. Next slide. We're going to take a look from South G Street here. Next slide. And one of the things that we've really been focused on is sort of the human dimension, who's affected by sea level rise. In this particular neighborhood, we have what I would define as a vulnerable community. And one example of that is that the home ownership rates in this neighborhood are 15%. It's about half the rest of the city at about 33%, and much, much less than the rest of the state of California. And so that brings up two things when I'm thinking about what sea level rise policy means to this community. For those who own their home, this is basically their entire life savings, and what we say in our policy dramatically affects their entire livelihood. For those who aren't fortunate enough to own their own homes, they don't have the resources to relocate. And moreover, there's nowhere for them to relocate in the city of Arcata right now. And so when we're thinking about how do we plan for adaptation, we're taking a little bit longer scale approach when we think about how do we relocate these people from these neighborhoods. Next slide, please. Zooming back out, next slide. And looking at this area down here, this is primarily an industrial neighborhood, if you will. And in this area, we have, you can see some legacy uses. There's, scrap yards, a bunch of bone yards for, for heavy equipment. There's a lot of potential for contamination. You can imagine if the water were flooding the streets here, we'd be worried about the fluids in those machines leaking out into the bay and affecting the ecosystems. Next slide. And so we have multiple reasons, from these different segments, whether it's the human scale, the ecology, the contamination, that we need to focus on. Well, how do we approach adaptation in this area, in this neighborhood? So we're going to zoom out a little bit and take a look at the topography of this area. Thank you, very intuitive. This is a LiDAR image showing lower elevations in darker blue and higher elevations in lighter blue. So this is part of what informs us about our sea level rise adaptation strategy in this area. We already have a lead in terms of elevation in that area. There's already a lot of infrastructure that's built up. In fact, this is former bay that has been filled and developed since back in the 1800s. Go ahead and go forward too. This area also has a lot of infrastructure that's already in place that's designed to manage stormwater. This is an inventory of the levees and other protective structures that surround this neighborhood. Red being bad, the lowest areas, black being good, you're in the highest areas in those, and you can see we have a lot of gaps in between. But what this tells us is that we wouldn't be building from scratch. We've got a lot of existing floodwater infrastructure in place, and whether that's stormwater coming down our creeks or floodwaters from the bay, we're not starting from scratch, and so that informs some of our local sea level rise adaptation policy. Next slide. We also don't want to go on a fool's errand here. We wanted to look at this from a cost feasibility perspective. In this area, we have what we'd estimate to fill most of those gaps to about 15 feet in elevation, 15 feet in elevation, a cost of about $30 million, which is, a significant sum if we were to do it all at once. Nobody's proposing to do it all at once, so. But the value of both private and public assets behind that infrastructure totals about $140 million. In addition, because there are businesses who make sales in that area, there's one indicator of the economic activity, sales tax revenue to the city of Arcata to the amount of $55,000 a year. And so the policies that we put into place, the ways that we approach the sea level rise adaptation strategies can really affect the values of these properties, the viability of functionally implementing adaptation, and the livelihoods of the people who rely on this. And then I also want to point out that the primary public value that's in that area is the Arcata wastewater treatment plant. And so everyone in the city of Arcata is affected by the sea level rise policy that we take on here. Next slide. Okay, so zooming out just a little more. Next slide. I wanted to give you sort of the more regional context for the work that we're doing. Next slide. One of the things we're proposing in our current local coastal program update is a coastal visitor serving overlay. We don't have any special overlays or special zoning types for the coastal zone at this point, but we're proposing to do one here. And part of the reason why we're doing this is because we think we can incentivize redevelopment of these properties and encourage people to move in the direction, move us towards uses that are easier to either adapt, become more resilient, or retreat over time. One of the examples I use is if we took one of those scrap yards and turned it into an RV park, they'd be cleaning up that scrap yard, moving all that junk to somewhere more appropriate, and then putting in a use that can maybe be used when there's periodic winter flooding in the near term. And then over the long term, that's a very easy asset to retreat from, right? Not a whole lot of contaminated equipment that no one's going to have the incentive to move once sea level rise is lapping at the doorstep there. Next slide. In addition, we're pairing this with the planning, long-range planning that we're doing in areas that aren't going to be subject to sea level rise within that time frame. I'm showing you here a plan that we just adopted a couple weeks ago after an 8-year planning process that is designed to incentivize redevelopment of a former industrial area into mixed use, high-density mixed use. That prepares us for places where we can relocate the businesses and occupants that live in this area that's potentially vulnerable to sea level rise in the future. And so we're taking this broader scale approach to try and plan for an adaptation strategy that doesn't impact current property values by coming out strong and saying, look, you just can't redevelop your properties anymore. And it also provides for a transition for our community. It starts to build out these new residences that will be required in order to have these people stay in our community. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to zoom out one more time because I've focused a lot on the urban infrastructure that we have that's subject to these vulnerabilities. Next slide. Up in the corner here, we have what was formerly a grazing paddock. It was agricultural lands that the city of Arcata purchased and then reestablished tidal influence into that area, pulling back the levee and creating new habitats. There's about 5 different habitats that occur in this area. The city has, over the last several decades, acquired lots of property in this area. Next slide. And we're doing projects all over the place to improve the habitat, to prepare for sea level rise, and to do what we can now so that as those sea levels rise, we'll have areas for the tidal marshes to migrate to. So this is a quote-unquote neighborhood as well that our sea level rise adaptation strategy is effective in. That doesn't require the same kinds of strategies that we might use or wish to apply in those urban areas. Next slide. So here's sort of a cartoon of those 2 areas, Zone 1 and Zone 2. And I have to thank your staff for recommending that we not call this the protection zone in Zone 1. We're just calling it Zone 1 now. But this is an area where we would see, defending for the near term, trying to establish protections in the near term, whereas Zone 2 is where we're planning for, migration of those habitats. And, we are now beginning on our pathways adaptation planning that would incorporate things like eco-levees, not hard armoring necessarily, but soft armoring that would include things like trails, coastal trails, that would expand on the Arcata Marsh and Wildlife Sanctuary, for example, that is already sort of world-renowned out there. Next slide. So I just want to give you a tangible example as I close. This is an image from the work that we've been doing recently on our wastewater treatment upgrade. We have a plant that was previously about 50, 60 years old, and our staff have done an excellent job of keeping that plant running, even though its lifespan was only 30 years. We're working with the Regional Water Board now to do an approximate $80 million project to upgrade our wastewater treatment plant. You've seen this project and approved phase 1 of this project. Phase 1 was broken out from phase 2, largely because of questions around sea level rise. And what you're looking at here is the land-based system that starts with, at the very south end, the oxidation ponds in yellow and blue, the treatment ponds, and then in red, the core plant, the mechanical components of the plant. These colors actually represent different levees that are considered in the application that we applied for the coastal development permit. They have different effectivenesses, costs, timeframes, but you can also look at this as a retreat strategy. We already have existing infrastructure here, as I mentioned before, and that yellow at some point we're likely to have to retreat from and maybe fall back to the blue and back to the red eventually before moving our treatment plant ultimately if sea level rise continues to rise at the rates that are projected. Next slide. Within all of these, though, there's sort of a chink in this armor, right where that arrow is, the next slide, the elevations are fairly low. Whereas the lowest elevation around the oxidation ponds are about 12 feet, 12 to 14 feet currently. In this area right here, it's about 10.5 feet. And that's right next to a new UV disinfectant system that we just installed. And so we have a near-term need to protect that from current storm events. 10-year event on top of a king tide would be enough to lap at the base of that UV disinfectant system. So you'll see this permit come to you. And when it does come to you, I hope that we're thinking about it in terms of this larger scale, the more global and more regional planning work that we're doing, and not just seen in the context of, is this infrastructure that was in place prior to the Coastal Act or not? Not just in place or in terms of the effect that it's going to have on this one parcel, but really the effect it's going to have on the entire city of Arcata if we can't maintain a serviceable treatment plant. We are planning on ultimately needing to move the treatment plant, but we need time to plan for that. We need to acquire the property, and we need to plan for the funding that's going to be necessary to, do that multi-million-dollar project. So that's, again, skimming the surface, rock across the pond, last 10 years worth of engagement that we've done with our community, and sort of the results that have come from that. I never knew it was called neighborhood scale adaptation planning until recently, but I appreciate the term. I do agree with Dr. Lester that we really need to be thinking of these in terms of different geographical units. So maybe there's another term to describe it, but from a local jurisdiction level, that really makes sense to me. Last slide, I just wanted to point out that we're not doing this work in a vacuum. We're working regionally with partners, both jurisdictions as well as consultants and other agencies. And so really want to recognize that a lot of this work is built on the shoulders of giants, and I feel fortunate to be able to work with those folks to bring these concepts and ideas. So thank you so much for your time and consideration.
I really want to thank our guest speakers. Thank you very much for coming. Much appreciated. And both commissioners and audience, I know we're testing your cognition here, and we are just about at a point to take a break and go into public comment. This is the last piece of just setting the context. Then I'll give us a preview of where we're headed, and then I'll turn it back to the chair so that we can take a break and do public comment. Please, Kelsey.
Thank you. Really quickly, and I do have a second slide presentation, should be labeled number 2. While that's coming up though, I just want to take a few seconds to wrap up this piece. We've heard a lot about all the variety of different shoreline types that exist in our communities, and really want to emphasize that these are obviously going to take different adaptation strategies to address those contexts. The good news is that in some places we do have wide beaches that will remain fairly resilient to sea level rise for a long time. Under the highest amounts of sea level rise, these beaches will be at greater risk, but there is additional time to plan for their protection over time. Next slide. Other coastal communities contend with sea level rise risks along both an open coast and a wetland marsh or other type of estuary habitat, oftentimes with development at risk from multiple sides. And in many of these areas, groundwater rise will also put development at risk, further limiting available adaptation options. Next slide. Still, other parts of our coastline are characterized by bluffs and cliffs, and as we know, locally specific geologic factors will affect erosion rates, the feasibility of different protection strategies, and the long-term shape of the coastline. Next slide. And as an example, some places along our coastline have formed pocket beaches, which provide unique, important beach access, even where there is not continuous sandy shoreline. The specific backshore characteristics will influence the extent to which these areas will persist into the future. The same applies for current rocky intertidal habitats, and both habitat protection and public access may need to be reimagined with higher amounts of sea level rise. Next slide. And of course, throughout all of these different coastline types, current development patterns will affect the timing and feasibility of different strategies. This is particularly true in areas where transportation infrastructure forms the first or second line of development, as lateral cross-jurisdictional development can be difficult to plan for. We do have several examples of highway realignments, but in many places, the space and options for realignment are significantly more constrained. And the presence of other development immediately adjacent to this infrastructure will also be influenced by, or itself may influence, the phasing of different strategies. Next slide. A variety of areas along the coast are already armored, including some places where a continuous structure or line of armoring protects multiple properties or a stretch of infrastructure. In some locations, such structures provide lateral access, including, importantly, for those who are unable to traverse sandy or rocky shorelines, such as folks in wheelchairs or with strollers. As with other armoring, though, these structures may result in coastal squeeze now or into the future, and shared armoring in particular may limit the ease with which armoring can be removed when necessary or appropriate. Next slide. Lastly, we have a variety of harbors, piers, boardwalks, and other similar development dotting the coast that support recreational fishing, boating, working waterfronts, public access, and other visitor-serving uses. The Coastal Act allows for armoring to protect coastal-dependent uses, but many such areas are characterized by a mix of dependent and related development. And even where protection is allowed, a variety of other strategies may be necessary to ensure resiliency into the future. Next slide. So we've highlighted all of these different shoreline and development types today in part to emphasize that we are going to need a wide variety of adaptation strategies no matter what, but also to stress that all of these decisions come with various trade-offs. The Local Government Working Group has suggested that neighborhood scale adaptation planning is one way to proactively think through and plan for those trade-offs in a balanced way. But as highlighted by many of the comments we've already received on this item and published in the correspondence packet, additional detail is needed to refine what types of policies and approaches are needed to ensure balanced protection of coastal resources. As I mentioned earlier, the working group has discussed some of the types of approaches and policies that might need to be included in an LCP to ensure Coastal Act consistency. These include things like requiring managed retreat, nature-based strategies, or other non-armoring approaches in some places at some point in the future, along with options to protect and improve coastal access where armoring is allowed. This may include things like upgrading armoring, such as moving from rock revetments to vertical seawalls to take up less beach space, and incorporating lateral and vertical access ways as part of these structures. Other considerations may include options for phasing out development over time, such as requiring removal or relocation of recurrent damaged properties, requiring removal of armoring with new development, and requiring smaller or more easily removable structures. Some of these things also continue to raise important related questions, such as what is the right mix of fully developed and implementable on-the-ground projects in the near term versus requirements to implement projects as opportunities present themselves and to continue planning, monitoring, and adjusting strategies as time goes on. So gathering feedback from the Commission and other stakeholders today on these types of considerations is the key goal of the working group, and so I will leave it there.
Kelsey, thank you. I'm going to stand over here for 2 seconds, even if it makes it difficult for the cameras, because I want to address the Commission as well as the audience today. And what I'm going to do is preview the questions for the discussion this afternoon, because we are inviting you into a discussion. This isn't just public comment. We're inviting you to comment on this. You're here to comment on whatever you like, and we're hoping that there's some information that can be gained on the same questions that we will be asking of the commissioners and the Local Government Working Group today. So the working group has been working with 2 facts in mind: that armoring comes with too many impacts and also is not equitable, and managed retreat everywhere is not possible right now. The legal nor fiscal nor logistic frameworks are in place for that. And so with that in mind, they've been working on the following questions. And if you care to address these in your public comments, and these will be the questions that we can work on this afternoon. Does the Commission, or do you, support the further exploration of neighborhood scale approaches, knowing that that term, neighborhood scale, is a placeholder? The word neighborhood is actually problematic here. We're just searching for something beyond parcels and below the scale of a city or a county. And what guidance can the commissioners, or you, provide the working group as they work to address key challenges in developing and implementing scaled approaches to be included in LCPs, including the appropriateness of armoring in certain scenarios, or not, and if not, why not? Incentivizing nature-based solutions and soft solutions. What kind of assurances do you want to see that would give you confidence that nature-based or soft solutions will be incentivized? The importance of risk and vulnerability disclosures and how to be intentional about that. The meaningful mitigation of any short-term hard solutions. What kind of assurances do you as commissioners, do you as California public and advocates want to see, if that's ever considered? Providing different types of coastal access and resource protection. What does it mean for the future? We just heard about some beaches, no matter what, probably won't remain the same. And so what does that mean for considering access more broadly? And finally, since this is about phased approaches, what are the timelines and thresholds for future review and planning? If there's going to be local flexibility in the near term and a phased approach, what are the thresholds for revisiting based on conditions? So Those are guiding questions that we'd like to pose to you as commissioners to have a discussion with the working group. And of course, you're here to comment on anything you like. And we're hoping to get some info on these things because this is a bigger discussion. Thank you very much, everyone, for your attention and your patience. Chair, I'd like to turn it back to you, and then we can do public comment as you like. Break in public comment, and then have a discussion for the remainder of our time today. Thank you for all of our presenters.
Thank you so much, Kaylin. All right, I think it's time to take a break. We're going to take a 15-minute break, and then we'll come back, and I'm going to have a little chat with the staff about how they want to approach public comment, if we're going to do it in a slightly different way, and I'll let you know when we get back. Okay? Thank you. Okay, everybody. All right, we're going to open public comment at this time. I don't know if I have a quorum. Do I have a quorum? 1, 2. Yes, I do. All right, great. All right, folks, so the way we're going to approach this is we have people in the room and on Zoom. Everyone will have 2 minutes. And then when we bring it back to the commission, we're sort of going to leave the public comment open so that we can have commissioners, if they have question of members of the public, or try to make it a much more sort of open back and forth. So Chris is going to be in charge of calling folks' names, and I understand that we have an elected here and would like to call on him first, please.
Yes, I'll just note that we have 18 people signed up to speak. We'll start with Tiger Jazz Big Stick, Mayor of Pacifica.
Former Mayor of Pacifica.
Are you still city council? Or
I'm still on the council. This is my term. I have a family that wants me back, and so...
we sort of know about that, but no. They've forgotten about us. No.
To some degree, we all know, but in my case, I
All right.
should have been last week, which is a theme, right?
Yeah.
Honorable Chair Hart, Coastal Commission, Coastal Staff, Working Group, and California stakeholders present or otherwise, I am council member, Tiger Jazz Twirls Big Stick of Pacifica, speaking my own observations and not necessarily representing any other body or group. This is the short, high level version of my thoughts after kind of working with this concept for a couple years now. In Pacifica, looking at this approach as maybe the only viable path to updating our LCP. We've spent about 10 meetings now understanding what we're calling special shoreline resiliency areas, or SSRAs, what they mean and what they mean for Pacifica. Between our friends who care deeply for our shoreline, who want hard armoring gone, and our friends with homes in hazard zones, let alone the coastal zone, who don't want their physical, let alone economic interests touched, as a city, we're left the terminally difficult job of trying to strike a balance. Our vital city infrastructure is bound for catastrophe if the armor protecting it fails. If we only rely on hard armoring, our beaches will fail. Without the money needed to do the job, which today Pacifica does not have, we cannot implement difficult strategies, let alone properly plan and design. That is where this neighborhood approach becomes so vital, and we need your help. Having been party to this process over a year and a half, while our staffs have been in the trenches hashing out the reality between a diverse set of needs for a decidedly unique community, one of many in California, where we need your help more than anywhere is the message that you are our partner in doing this work. That we really are doing it together, that this is our tool for supporting each other in engaging in perpetuity with the very difficult work that not just my community of Pacifica, but many, if not most communities in California will need to succeed against the backdrop of our ever-changing climate and environment. Thank you.
Thank you. Continuing with people in the room, we have Mike Guth, or Guth, followed by Don Schmitz, Anthony Tersall, and then Mandy Sackett. Mike.
Can I just ask if there are any other electeds that would like to speak? All right. Seeing none, please come forward.
Thank you. I did have a presentation. Guth, G-U-T-H. Oh, there we go, okay. Thank you, Chair and Commissioners. It was a fascinating discussion. I'm glad to have heard everything. A little bit of it seems to me to be awfully optimistic because they haven't gone through processes. I was a longtime planning commissioner in the County of Santa Cruz, and I went through the entirety of the process. I think it was starting in 2018, where Mr. Carlson was the lead from the planning department, where we went through the LCP rise, the bluff development, the scale areas, and all of that. And I have a few concerns I'd like to share with you and some cautions. And Mr. Carlson said that it was controversial locally. That's an understatement. And there was primarily three groups of people that were represented when you have these kinds of meetings that I saw. The people looking out for public resources, present owners of qualifying existing structures who are concerned about being able to maintain their smaller scale existing stuff, and then a small number of extremely loud, extremely wealthy, extremely aggressive developers that want to go for broke on every bluff. And it's not just for living, it's investment. And they are overrepresented in these discussions at the local level, which I believe led to the failure of the Santa Cruz process. I want to, next slide, please. Time doesn't allow me to go into that more, but I want to talk about what constitutes a neighborhood scale. That's the built-in area of the mid-county. Next slide, please. That's the, with the white, that's the county planning jurisdiction. Next slide, please. And this is what would actually have to be looked at as separate little bits that would be looked at, each of these little bluffs. And interesting to hear Dr. Lester say you have to be bigger than that, but you do have to be bigger, but you have to be smaller or you don't get anywhere. Next slide, please. This is an area where all
Can
of
you hold
those-
on one sec?
Yeah.
Can we give an additional minute, please? Just don't want you to have to
Okay.
freak out and rush so fast.
Well, 2 minutes. Let me go back to the back of 2 slides, please. Is that possible? So that's an area that was designated. That's only a portion of one of the areas that they were going to get all of the existing rules. Oh, that was the proposal. Existing structure protections. If you go to the next slide, these areas were ones that I had identified originally. There, where we would use neighborhood scale so that as we looked forward to removing some of these protection devices, if you had a small area, somebody builds a new house, they have to site it rearward of a 100-year erosion line. That means they should be able to take their wall out, but don't require them to because the next door neighbor is going to then lose his stuff. So you have these stretches where people are slowly upscaling rearward of erosion lines, and when it all happens, you take out the wall. That was, to me, what neighborhood scale was, not as an excuse to armor. And I have to say, the most reassuring thing I've heard of today so far was from the executive director when she said that this is not meant to be a loophole of some kind, this neighborhood scale stuff, and I'm so glad to hear that. Last slide, please, if we could get there. The question is, what do we, next one, please. What do we have for our vision? Is it going to be seawalls with no shoreline? And if we upsize along the bluffs, which is where this goes locally when the challenges come, you limit your future options. And wish I had more time, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Don Schmitz, Anthony Tersall, and then Mandy Sackett.
Afternoon, Commissioners. Don Schmitz on behalf of Smart Coast, California. If there's awards given to exemplary staff work, Kelsey ought to get one. That was a fantastic presentation report that she made, which concisely and clearly reflected the work of the working group. Smart Coast, California has been dedicated to finding smart solutions to this conundrum. Commissioner Wilson spoke towards the inherent tension between the commission and local governments. That's true, but the law, the Coastal Act itself, specifies that for the adoption of the local coastal programs, it's a partnership between the counties and the cities and the Coastal Commission. And candidly, the process was breaking down. It was failing because the local jurisdictions just could not wrap their mind around what the implications were going to be for global managed retreat. We had to come up with better options. And that has been the goal and objective of the working group and of Smart Coast California. We have had several sea level rise summits where we brought some of the best coastal engineers, attorneys, including attorneys from the Attorney General's office, and the best land use planners to come up with solutions. And there are solutions. We don't have to armor the coast, and we don't have to abandon some of our most iconic communities in the state of California. And those have been brought forward. And one of them is being personified by what is being proposed now in the city of Oceanside. They have a pending project. It's called the Artificial Headlands Project, where it will have 2 artificial headlands, a beach nourishment program, and an artificial reef. They're actually bringing in the engineering firm from Australia to do this. It's an area south of the pier, which is all just currently, there's next to no sand, and there's an endless revetment down the entire stretch of the beach. Now, it's not a neighborhood with just a block or 2 of homes, it's a whole stretch, but that is in fact the neighborhood. And I would leave you with this. We need to amend those local coastal programs, but all of these more forward-thinking, nature-based solutions will have to come before you anyways. If it's an artificial reef or anything which touches the water, even in an LCP zone, it will need a coastal development permit from this commission.
Thank you. Anthony Tersall, Mandy Sackett, and then we'll start our Zoom participants.
Anthony Tersall, representing the local chapter of Surfrider. My comment today would be that, and you said that neighborhoods was sort of a placeholder. And so I would say you need something different. And because planning entities are looking at mostly property lines, and it makes sense to go from the parcel level to something bigger, but I would posit that you probably need to regard also that the ocean doesn't really care about property lines or city limits. And I would use as an example, locally, the Marina Sand Plant, which the Coastal Commission was instrumental in getting to terminate. It was causing erosion all the way down into the city of Monterey. And we certainly wouldn't call that a neighborhood from the sand plant to there. And so your planning needs to sort of recognize the scales at which the ocean is operating in addition to the scales at which the jurisdictions are operating. And defining a neighborhood people will tend to think about that in terms of the human side of it, but the geomorphology may be more important. So you could have 2 neighbors that are right next door to each other that are subject to very different ocean processes. And so thinking about that will probably help, because the way it is now, there will be a tendency for people to want to build seawalls on a neighborhood scale. So that would be the downside of the language, is that instead of fighting individual property owners, you will now be fighting local jurisdictions who are trying to put in neighborhood scale seawalls. Thank you.
Thank you. Mandy Sackett, and then our first 3 Zoom speakers will be Joy Downing-Riley, followed by Mitch Silverstein, and then Kimberly Williams. Mandy Sackett.
Hello, Mandy Sackett, Senior California Policy Coordinator for the Surfrider Foundation. So nice to be before you in person finally. We agree that visioning and multi-scale adaptation planning are important parts of effectively managing our coastlines. The intention to balance planning, incentivize nature-based solutions, and reduce reliance on hard structures are absolutely necessary. But I'm here to express a major concern. The neighborhood scale approach, as described by the working group, has the potential to dramatically expand coastal armoring across California. What we're seeing on the ground is that local governments are not hearing the commission staff's message about balancing and nature-based solutions. Instead, they're running with the concept of neighborhood scale as a green light for large-scale armoring, often with little regard to mitigation. Pacifica's proposed LCP update, for example, includes large-scale seawalls, but doesn't reflect a robust approach to mitigation or restoration. It kicks the can down the road by requiring a shoreline management plan, and within 10 years that might deal with those questions. And that appears to be supported by staff, so we're really concerned about it. Residents are outraged, asking why one neighborhood gets a seawall and why not theirs? And now they're asking for, can we just armor all neighborhoods? And there are really loud calls for that. If we move forward with this neighborhood scale adaptation framework, we need clear criteria that strictly limits and mitigates any large-scale armoring to exceptional circumstances. Legally, new development, even a street back or two as they're redeveloping behind these seawalls, cannot be allowed to rely on seawalls. Full stop. That's the basis of the Coastal Act. And this approach is not a Coastal Act policy conflict, and conflict resolution is not the appropriate way to justify this. Conflict resolution cannot be used as a sidestep to allow new development to rely on seawalls. And we describe more of that in our letter. I hope if you have a chance to look at it, we greatly appreciate it and hope that can guide your discussion today. But I think if we can really get some more nuance to this discussion, that would be a really big win for the day. Like, what exactly does mitigation look like? And what are your expectations of local governments as they build this into their policies? I think setting those out would be a huge step forward. So thank you.
Thank you. Now moving to Zoom, Joy Downing-Riley, followed by Mitch Silverstein, and then Kimberly Williams. Joy Downing-Riley.
Hello. My name is Joy. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay, thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Hart, commissioners, and staff. My name is Joy Downing-Riley, and I'm a program lead volunteer for Surfrider Ventura County chapter and an advocate for public coastal access and wildlife, like our beloved sea lions who depend on our natural coastlines. As you know, Ventura County already has the highest rate of coastal armoring in California, and this new proposal with the neighborhood scale adaptation policy threatens to worsen that potential erosion by allowing large-scale seawalls that could wall off even more of our beaches and increase erosion specifically along Highway 1 between Seacliff and Emma Wood beaches and between Port Magoo Rock and Malibu. I'm really concerned about the neighborhood scale adaptation policy and its potential to increase coastal armoring in our county. While that may not be the Coastal Commission staff intention, it certainly seems to be the intention of our local government. While Ventura County has incorporated this concept into their draft LCP update for coastal hazards as a way to allow neighborhood scale seawalls, but it does not propose to remove armoring elsewhere or define what mitigation would look like. In this loophole already, as Coastal Commission staff locally and our county are aware, a homeowner at Feria Beach Colony went ahead and built a seawall at Feria Beach, which is hazardous to anybody on the beach, and you cannot walk around it without going into the tide. Seawalls may protect private property, but they destroy public trust resources like beaches, wildlife habitats, and access to the coast. This goes against the California Coastal Act's mission, as Mandy stated, to protect public access and recreation. Our coastlines need room to adapt to rising seas, and we should focus on nature-based solutions, as I'm sure the commission is well aware.
All right, thank you. Next, Mitch Silverstein, followed by Kimberly Williams, and then Peter Loeb. Mitch Silverstein.
Thank you. Mitch Silverstein, San Diego County Policy Manager for Surfrider Foundation. Our San Diego County chapter has concerns about where this concept of neighborhood-style adaptation invariably might lead. Adaptation is a loaded word. Some preserve our beaches, like dune restoration, living shorelines, and relocation of threatened assets. Surfrider supports those. Other adaptation destroys our beaches, like armoring, which is by far what we see most of from both local governments and private property owners in San Diego County. That's why when I read neighborhood-style adaptation, what I fear is neighborhood-style seawalls. 38% of the Southern California coast is already armored, representing a 500% increase over the last 50 years. And with rising seas, the number of armoring applications is going to go up before it goes down. This paradigm needs to change regardless of whether it's parcel by parcel or at neighborhood scale. Our coast is already armored at a neighborhood scale in several San Diego cities. mitigation, if any, has been inadequate, and the result has been less beach, less access. I appreciate the Commission's focus on environmental justice, but it must be said the continued armoring of our coast to protect multi-million-dollar homes at the expense of beaches that belong to everyone, including our most vulnerable communities, is likely the most pervasive environmental injustice occurring under the Commission's purview. Let's ensure the result of this working group is streamlining the process for adaptation that preserves our beaches, not the armoring that destroys them. If our vision of the future includes beaches and coastal access, we need less armoring, not more of it. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Next, Kimberly Williams, followed by Peter Loeb, and then Peter McNamee. Kimberly Williams.
Hi. Thank you, Chair Hart and Commissioners. I'm Kimberly Williams, representing the San Mateo County chapter of Surfrider Foundation. Our chapter is very concerned about the Special Shoreline Resiliency Areas policy proposed in Pacifica's draft LCP update, which favors neighborhood-scale seawalls at Rockaway and Sharp Park without defining meaningful mitigation or long-term solutions. Ms. Sackett's comments earlier are accurate. I've attended almost all of the meetings Pacifica has held on their LCLUP development, and the city has consistently ignored robust public feedback opposing the Special Shoreline Resiliency Areas. SSRAs are controversial in the Pacifica community, with neighborhoods outside of the proposed areas feeling left out, unprotected, and opposed to these plans as inequitable. Pacifica's residents, who may not always agree on the details, have lately been in agreement that they don't support the SSRA carve-outs. The mitigation proposed is vague and inadequate, simply calling for a shoreline management plan without specifying how public access, natural resources, or beaches will be protected for the public. We know seawalls aren't the answer. While they may protect some homes in the short term, they increase erosion and threaten the beaches we all depend on for recreation, access, and natural beauty. Choosing between those people who are privileged enough to own a beachside home, the realtors and developers who benefit, and members of the public who can only enjoy our beaches as visitors can be a hard choice for cash-strapped cities like Pacifica. I ask the Coastal Commission to reject this approach until a clearer, more balanced policy focused on nature-based solutions and real mitigation measures is developed. We need policies that protect the entire coastline for everyone to enjoy, not just select neighborhoods. Please stay the course on meaningful LCP requirements that uphold the Coastal Act. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Next, Peter Loeb, followed by Peter McNamee, and then Cindy Abbott. Peter Loeb.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Peter Loeb. I'm a former mayor of Pacifica. I always say that and $7.50 will get me a latte at Starbucks, but I share Surfrider's concerns about Pacifica's proposed special shoreline resiliency areas. The concern is that these proposed, if you call them neighborhood scale adaptations, what they're proposing to do is increase development where there is existing armoring, and also to increase existing armoring. Both of those ideas or proposals, or whatever you want to call them, seem to me to be in conflict with the Coastal Act and against what the Commission is trying to accomplish here. Neighborhood scale adaptations, to me, don't mean increased development where there is armoring and increased armoring. I don't think that the Commission should pursue that, or the Commission should make it clear that that's not acceptable in a neighborhood scale adaptation plan. I hope that the Commission will discuss this problem and make it clear that increased development where there is existing armoring and increasing existing armoring is not something that the LCLUP should be pursuing. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Next, Peter McNamee, followed by Cindy Abbott, and then Kristen Brenner. Peter, we haven't been able to move you in as a panelist, so I'm allowing you to unmute as an attendee. You should be able to unmute yourself. Once again, sorry.
Unmute it.
There we go.
I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, we can hear you.
Peter McNamee. I live in Fort Bragg in Northern California. And I want to say that this is an opportunity to do something very significant that's absolutely needed, in our opinion, which is to update the LCP and CDP process to reflect conditions that weren't present previously. When the Coastal Act, Proposition 20, was enacted by voters in the early 1970s, the public's understanding of the looming climate crisis we're facing today was minimal at best. But as Naomi Klein so aptly noted, climate change changes everything. Now the biggest threat to California is the devastating impact of climate change. New America, a Washington, D.C. based think tank, issued a report this spring estimating 50 million Americans will be displaced by climate disasters over the next 30 years. Millions of those will be Californians, driven from homes and businesses by sea level rise, flooding, wildfires, droughts, and excessive heat. The working group's proposed recommendations are a step, in our opinion, in the right direction. The strongest argument for these recommendations is that they open the door to a new approach to land use management in the coastal zone, tailored to the climate dynamics driving changes to California and the coastal resources. Tailoring LCPs and CDPs to the circumstances of each unique coastal area impacted by climate change makes absolute sense. And as climate disasters drive more and more people from homes and businesses, California needs to recognize that many underdeveloped areas in more temperate California areas will become climate havens for these refugees. Shifting populations and commerce results in a new demand on California's central and northern coastal zones. And we absolutely need to plan for those kinds of changes as we go forward with our LCP and CDP project. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Next, Cindy Abbott, followed by Kristen Brenner, and then Natalie Claggett. Cindy Abbott.
Good afternoon. I'm Cindy Abbott, a Pacifica resident. I've been making public comment about special shoreline resiliency areas, a fancier name for neighborhood scale adaptation, since December, when the city of Pacifica dropped this idea on the public, creating for the first time a unified community voice strongly opposed to the concept. The discussions in Pacifica are an example of how this concept can be subverted into an attempt to undermine the Coastal Act and to receive Coastal Commission endorsement of hard armoring of the shoreline without legitimate mitigations. Coastal advocates recognize that this approach is not new or novel, but a repackaged attempt to expand hard armoring of the coast, locking in what should be a dynamically naturally changing shoreline in support of new intensified development in a coastal hazard zone. And personal property right advocates are already clamoring for the unapproved concept to be expanded throughout the city. Municipalities can and already do plan by geographic subregion that includes triggers. Require this in all LCPs. It's imperative to ensure that a neighborhood scale approach doesn't deter from the important need to create a vision for the entire shoreline of a municipality, not a piecemeal approach that carves out sections creating inequity between neighborhoods and leaves future generations to work through the difficult decisions that some are trying to kick the can down the road for. The Coastal Commission can provide direction to refocus this discussion back to basics. Say no to carving out sections of the California coast. Say yes to visionary planning that requires nature-based solutions to be the primary approach, significant mitigations for any short to midterm armoring to be developed prior to approval of any plans, and that establishes and requires the difficult but necessary need to holistically plan for the long-range future. I provided additional details in writing. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Kristen Brenner, Natalie Claggett, and then Carolyn Kramer. Kristen Brenner, I see that you're on a phone. You should be able to speak now. Or you should be able to unmute. You may need to dial *6 to unmute.
Hi, my name is Kristen Brenner, and I'm a resident of Solana Beach. If anyone is familiar with our city, you'll know we're essentially a poster child for while the concept of neighborhood scale seawalls is a terrible idea. The majority of our coastline, all 2 miles of it, is armored and being destroyed by seawalls because sequences of bluff-top homes are being allowed to construct massive seawalls to protect multiple homes. Many of those homes, in fact, are non-Free Coastal Act homes or homes with deed restrictions that should never have been allowed a seawall. And when I have opposed many of these permits for the construction of these seawalls over the last decade as part of my role as the beach preservation co-lead for the San Diego chapter of the Surfrider Foundation, we've heard from the Coastal Commission that we need a more regional approach to these issues. And to me, the concept of a neighborhood approach to seawalls seems like the very opposite of a regional approach. The idea of neighborhood scale seawalls risks undermining established protections and may lead to more contentious debates and legal challenges. And the construction of seawalls directly contradicts the core principles of the Coastal Act, such as the preservation of natural landforms, public access, and marine resources. This concept should be rejected, as our current city currently, unfortunately, has shown how disastrous this kind of approach is. To me, this concept seems like it's an attempt to get around the basic tenets and founding principles of the Coastal Act. We should not take any steps towards loosening the already inadequate rules about the construction of seawalls. We should only be looking at strengthening that, as this is the only way our beaches will possibly survive in light of sea level rise. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Natalie Claggett, followed by Carolyn Kramer, and then Sherry Mackin. Natalie.
Good afternoon, Chair Hart and Commissioners. I'm Natalie, representing the Coastal Environmental Rights Foundation. We believe the neighborhood scale adaptation policy, if not carefully scrutinized, could result in widespread reliance on seawalls at a neighborhood scale with significant statewide implications. We need to ensure that new development is not subtly allowed to depend on seawalls, which contradicts the Coastal Act's goal of preserving natural shorelines and maintaining public access. The criteria for adaptation must be clearly spelled out to prevent this, and any assumptions leading to neighborhood scale armoring need to be challenged. There's a risk of setting a dangerous precedent if we don't establish rigorous mitigation measures and address conflict between private property benefits and protecting public resources. Without these safeguards, the policy could both erode both the coastlines and the integrity of the Coastal Act. We urge the Commission to ensure that any adaptation plan is transparent, legally sound, and designed to protect public trust resources and natural landforms statewide. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Carolyn Kramer, Sherry Mackin, and then Kathleen Steindelberger. Carolyn Kramer.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Carolyn Kramer, and I'm the chairperson for the Citizens for the Preservation of Parks and Beaches in Oceanside. Oceanside is the perfect example of what not to do on our coastline. Our coastline in Oceanside is 85 to 90% armored with riprap and hard structures. Our beaches have and are seriously eroded. The areas of our coastline that are not armored with riprap have some dry sand, which allows the waves to run up instead of hitting a hard structure and taking it out to the ocean. The public is now forced onto this narrow 10 to 15% portion of sand, while private property owners have a private beach. This is directly related to an item Coastal Commission heard earlier today on environmental justice. Please learn from our past mistakes and do not allow more construction of hard structures going forward on any beach. And I'd like to, in response to a previous speaker about the proposed re-beach project in Oceanside, CPPB feels that this project is nothing more than more hard structures that block and stop the natural flow of sand. We call it lipstick on a pig. We support nature-based adaptation methods and beach nourishment. We support beach access for all. Thank you for all of you do.
Thank you. Next, Sherry Mackin, Kathleen Steindelberger, and then Samuel Casillas. Sherry Mackin. Sherry, you should be able to unmute.
There we go. Sorry about that. Honorable Commission, Sherry Mackin, Oceanside resident and former deputy mayor for the city of Oceanside. In opening, I want to thank you for your work over the years trying to make sense of the task at hand and work for equitable solutions to the challenges we face. Again, I thank you. Regarding Section 30235 of the Coastal Act, I find a portion of the section to be an absolute oxymoron in that how can shoreline armoring both protect existing structures and protect public beaches in danger of erosion? In Oceanside's case, our beaches are fully armored from Wisconsin Street to the Buena Vista Lagoon, which equates to 2/3 of Oceanside's 3 miles of beaches. I wholeheartedly agree with the Commission's thoughts that armoring has too many impacts, and as stated by Dr. Lester, if we continue to harden the back of the shore, we will lose beaches. And that is exactly what we have seen and continue to see in South Oceanside. I don't look at pulling riprap out and replacing it with a seawall as an equitable solution. In the same way, I do not consider adding more hard structures such as artificial headlands and artificial reefs to be an equitable adaptation measure, merely more armoring. I dread the thought of more beach loss in South Oceanside with permitting and more beach armoring and hard structures. Instead, I would prefer to see nature-based adaptation measures that would allow for better public access and help to retain the sand on our beaches. I would ask that any new policy should be fair and accessible to all communities, especially those that may not have the resources for expensive adaptation measures. We must avoid solutions that do not provoke equitable coastal access. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Kathleen Steindelberger, followed by Samuel Casillas, and then Eileen Boken. Kathleen Steindelberger.
Hello, my name is Kathleen Steindelberger. I'm from Carlsbad. I formerly served for over 6 years on Carlsbad's Beach Preservation Commission. Neighborhood scale nature-based projects such as the dune restoration and living shoreline should be prioritized and incentivized for the neighborhood scale adaptation project. Coastal Commission can potentially streamline permitting for nature-based alternatives to seawalls. The city of Carlsbad has been working on updating their LCP since at least 2017. Many of the studies they've done are from 2017. The city of Carlsbad is an example of a city who is trying to change the definition of existing. They have a legislative agenda that opposes the current definition of existing structures and are trying to change the Coastal Act to include structures existing up to the date of their new LCP and amendments. Our city actually has an opportunity now to remove a southbound Carlsbad Boulevard coastal highway, which is often inundated with waves and overcome with rocks, and replace it with a sandy beach. But instead, the city is pursuing a project to leave the roadway in place and possibly armor it further and develop this coastline with new visitor-serving commercial uses. So please incentivize cities to do the right thing for the coast and the beaches. And one last comment is please fund more enforcement staff in the city. In San Diego County, we have one staff person for over 70 miles of highly developed coastline. We can have all these plans in the world, but if we don't have anyone going out and actually checking out all of the violations along our coastline, it's going to be a waste of the public.
All right, thank you. Next, Samuel Casillas, and then Eileen Boken. Samuel Casillas. Sam, you're in as a panelist. You should be able to unmute.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Dear Commissioners, you have my comments representing the Pedro Point Community Association of Pacifica about our significant concerns regarding the neighborhood scale adaptation as a misdirected effort. Pacifica's only alternative to sea level rise is more seawalls, and the plan is to further expand hard armoring throughout our city for the benefit of more development and their lobbyists in hazard zones, and we are aligned with the Surfrider Foundation. In neighborhoods like Pedro Point, we have the opportunity to implement a nature-based solution in the Pedro Point field and wetland, a known hazard zone, that will protect the surrounding homes, and yet the city instead is advocating change from commercial recreational to residential for undisclosed reasons. As an individual, I find it risible that today's Cal City Coastal Group Chair and our City Council representatives talks a good game about neighborhood scale adaptation, yet she completely ignores all the scientific data and major concerns her own constituents present to her about the Pedro Field and wetland site. In fact, SAMCAR provided the most funding and endorsed her election to Pacifica City Council. To be candid, our local government has been compromised by developer and realtor lobbyist groups that include the San Mateo Realtor Association and Smart Coast in order to protect their business interests and double down on development in hazard zones with armoring despite the direct, destructive, and well-established consequences for coastal public access and resources. These lobbying groups have explicitly directed local coastal governments to oppose all efforts to compromise in updating the LCLUPs in order to expand development on the coast. We know you are doing best to find compromise, but please do not ignore the voices of the people who are here to defend you and the Coastal Act. Thank you.
Thank you. And then all our speakers were accounted for today. Our last speaker is Eileen Boken. Eileen, you're joining via phone. You should be able to unmute now.
Eileen Boken, Coalition for San Francisco Neighborhoods, speaking on my own behalf. Not all cities are aligned with Coastal Commission requirements. For example, the San Francisco Planning Director said publicly that he considers the Coastal Commission requirements to be bureaucratic and a waste of time. And also, the city's LCP has not seen any major updates since its inception in 1986. There have been some amendments that have come through for the Western Shoreline Area Plan, the land use plan. However, this was a process that was spearheaded by a pro-development think tank and did not contain basically the best available science at the time. And since it's coming out, it's released in 2012, it's outdated science. So I would encourage the commission to actually look at do LCPs have the best available science? Thank you.
Thank you. Caitlin. Or Madam Chair.
Kaylin? Back to you.
Commissioners, it's now time for your discussion to talk to each other, the local government working group, any of the parties here. There's only one direct request that the working group, one question the working group has for you today. Do you support exploring neighborhood scale, or we would love a better name, of these scaled approaches going forward? And then there are ongoing questions, but we recognize that it's hard to have answers to all of these questions today. So we'd love to hear anything that you have to say about them or guidance for us to work on them. And those are questions about what it takes to go from this general concept, which enjoys a lot of support, not universal support, but enjoys a lot of support and promise, and to go after the hard questions of what it would take to actually include this, what you would like to see from local governments. If they're asking for local flexibility, what assurances do you see to address the concerns that you've heard here today, to make sure that it is not a loophole that can be abused, and instead is a thoughtful approach that honors the Coastal Act and coastal protection. So please, at your discretion, I'm happy if there's a bunch of folks to manage a queue. Otherwise, you can just have a conversation, providing your comments to each other, to the local working group, to the extent that they have answers. We've got about an hour. Please, anything you'd like to know or say about neighborhood scale approaches?
So Kaylin, how do you want to approach this? Do you want to just sort of, you can recognize various commissioners versus me doing it, since you're looking? And
that would, if you're comfortable with that, Chair, I'd be happy to do that. And I'll look for opportunities for where people want to chime in to the extent they have information. But I'll acknowledge commissioners if that's okay with you.
Right, and if commissioners have members of the public that they want to question to, or the original
Then I'll run a
speakers. That's
mic
fine.
and we'll get
Okay,
them in there
so I'm
too.
going to turn it over to you now for.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Escalante, did you want to start?
Yes, thank you, Caleb, and thanks everybody. This has been a wonderful meeting. I think, a lot of important things discussed, and I guess I want to jump in with my questions. I don't want to be remiss to thank our local government representatives. Thank you so much. I know this is extra work to all the already busy stuff that you have, but it is so critical and important because we're not talking about, in 50 years, these impacts are already happening, we're seeing them. And before, we turn into some of those East Coast islands where the houses get washed away into the ocean. It's important for us to be planning now. We're a little bit, behind, obviously, on all climate mitigation and adaptation issues, for sure. And we're feeling the pain, and we're going to feel it even more. But at least I'm delighted to. My first local government meeting was back when I started in 2018. So I've aged a lot since, and learned along with it. And I think that to answer sort of first the question, and I guess before I go into my own questions, is I am definitely in support of a regional approach. Absolutely, 100%. What that definition of that region is, maybe the word neighborhood is too small, we'll work on sort of finessing the language. I think language is obviously very important to define policy, but I'm definitely on the team that this is going in the right direction. So, I guess some of the questions that popped up as the conversation was going, as I was reading through this stuff, was definitions. And of course, again, as climate change is happening, this is sort of, we're dealing with it now, we're facing it now, developing the language to sort of change our society to adapt to it. And I think that, it is important for us to, as Charles Lesser said, to define beaches, to define what beaches means. I think that, for some folks, it's only a sandy beach. For other folks, it could be a tide pool, rocky mix kind of beach. So I think it would be good to get a better sort of clearer picture of the definition of that. What is a beach? I originally wrote, what is the definition of neighborhood scale? I see that everybody kind of has a question about that. So I figure that we're all going to kind of further polish that definition and understanding of that. Another definition that I would like to understand better is access sheds. I thought that was a kind of a creative term, and it kind of goes to address the issues that I was bringing up this morning, which Dr. Huckabridge reminded us of, which is, it's not just the immediate neighborhood of the coastline, not even immediately inland, but it's really sort of inland across the state. And more people find themselves fleeing, even if it's temporarily, even if it's just for a day, fleeing their inland communities because it's becoming dangerous to live in a lot of places. So to me, I think that, and the other one was from the gentleman from Arcata, the planner, is eco-armoring. I think that was another term that I think that, folks are going to be using it. We should definitely work on a very clear definition so that it doesn't become a term to greenwash, future approaches. So those are one last definition. Upsizing above bluffs. I think our Santa Cruz representative mentioned that. I don't understand what upsizing above bluffs within that context of conversation. I think I would like to understand more about that. And to just finalize, I think that, beaches and coastal access is going to more and more just be the refuge for this climate impacts from the vicious fires, from the heat waves, from the worsening air quality because of all of the above. The World Meteorological Organization in 2023 reported that extreme heat causes the greatest mortality of all the extreme weather. Everyone is hurt by all of this, but the impacted that are the most impacted are the EJ communities, as we've also reiterated today, in particular those inlands, the poor, the elderly, the disabled, and of course, people of color. So expanding that shed region, whatever we're going to call this, expanding the perspective, the engagement, the outreach, the conversation, I think it'll be critical. I'm almost thinking of sort of the vision of corridors, from inland to the coast where, we're going to be able to manage that so it doesn't exacerbate problems. It doesn't politically push towards more development on areas that are at risk and towards more armoring. So those are my issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, Commissioner Nothoff.
Thank you. One idea comes to mind is we're not really talking about neighborhoods, we're talking about landforms and related landforms. And I wonder if we get something that's more geographically related, if that might help some of these one neighborhood against another conflicts. I do want to say that there are, the way the Coastal Act has been applied by the Commission in terms of being very judicious about allowing any armoring has worked in a lot of places. So the overall assumption that we've got a problem everywhere doesn't seem to me to be right. We have figured it out in some places. We haven't figured it out in other places. Yes, the coast is changing, but as I think staff laid out well, there's some areas where it's changing more rapidly than others. So I like the idea of having something that's adaptable on a more localized basis. And even within jurisdictions, there's different challenges within a single jurisdiction. So I think I feel like this is, what did the Supreme Court Justice say with pornography? You know it when you see it. It was like, you don't want the wall along the coast, and we can see that, and we know we don't want it. But how do we get to a more regularized softening of how and more nature-based forms? I think I wanted to thank Surfrider and the other groups that wrote to us with a very thoughtful letter with some good ideas about how do we move in this direction, get away from the parcel by parcel approach, but how do we do it in a way that doesn't exacerbate some of the armoring problems that we're already seeing. So that was just a couple of thoughts, maybe to get more landform away from neighborhood, which has a connotation of more houses, yeah. So those were some thoughts I had. And then I guess the other thing I wanted to just emphasize that I liked from what I heard from a lot of the public input was the importance of prioritizing protecting public resources. And not have this be so focused on just protecting private properties, that there's also a lot of public resources along the California coast, as Chair Hart reminds us every commission hearing about all the state parks and all the others. So I think that should be a prominent priority for any type of adaptation strategy.
Thank you. Please, Chair.
Thanks. So since I'm not technically acting as chair here, I will go ahead and, I just start out with this whole process and having read everything, and I'm so appreciative of all the work of our local government partners and our commissioners and everyone that's engaged in this. But, I keep coming back to a starting point of trying to understand what about our approach now of using existing development is not working. I feel like I really need an understanding of that. Where did it result? We took this action. Now we have, almost 50 years of the Coastal Act to look at. When we took an action, when did it get the result or not get the result? In other words, we need a clear understanding of why we are doing this. Are we doing this because simply our LCP process is grinding to a halt? Because local governments just won't proceed? They can't proceed because they don't agree with managed retreat? You know, for me to make any decisions about this, I need to have a much better understanding of that. Like, what is the problem we're trying to solve? So that's a starting point. I mean, not, you know, that's a simplified way, but you get what I'm saying. Number two is, I want to talk a lot more in this process about habitat and what the impacts are of these actions. Because we talk so much about the impact on private property or public beaches or whatever, but we really don't talk that much about what the impacts are on all the species that live in these areas. When we armor, what happens to them? That is something that I really want to include. In terms of the term neighborhood, you know, like everyone, I'm not really happy with that. And to me, it's more of a regional approach, you know. And I also don't like the use of mitigation in this context, because I don't think that we want to get into a position where we're allowing armoring and then mitigating. What I really think we want to do here is look at these regions and determine if armoring is necessary here, then what is the negative impact going to be, the cost versus benefits, and then, you know, instead of looking at mitigation, just looking at it sort of as part of the regional approach. And we are going to use managed retreat here, and we are going to use, you know, natural forms of adaptation here, et cetera. So those are the things that I just keep going through my head. But at the end of the day, it's going to be a hybrid approach. You know, we're going to be looking at existing development. We can't just throw that out. I'm concerned about legal ramifications as well. Keeps going through my mind of some big shift in how we approach this. So I see this as being, you know, a hybrid approach where we're looking at regional areas, but also looking at existing development, what they might be entitled to. But really, returning to what I said initially, for me, before, at least in my mind, I can really go forward, I need a much better understanding of what is working and what isn't working and why it's not working.
Please, let's spend a moment on that. Let's give a little bit of space to that. In order to give a second just to organize your thoughts, actually, they're already ready.
They're
so
organized.
all of yeah, please, go right ahead.
Thank you, Chair Hart, for that question. Let me speak to what's not working. Maybe that's the simplest thing. The LCP process has gotten exceedingly long and often deadlocked. And I would submit that it's not simply because local jurisdictions don't agree with managed retreat. There are fundamental aspects of a vision that the Commission might hold that simply can't be implemented given private property rights and the respect we have to give to the takings clause of the U.S. Constitution. And I know you wrestle with this all the time. So, you know, the vision that we have, you know, considerable amounts of this coastline armored parcel to parcel to parcel. And I think there are some who envision that somehow that armoring is all going to go away, nature's going to take its course, and all that development, all those private property interests are simply going to disappear. That's just at the edge or outside what's practical. What is going to happen in any kind of particular timescale. I'll give you another reason, I think, why this process has gotten bogged down, and it happens both in the planning process and in the project-by-project process. But in the planning process, I'm a great fan of nature-based solutions. But let's think about what those are. Those are massive construction projects. They're nature-based. They're not natural process. They're nature-based that have huge capital costs up front and considerable ongoing maintenance costs. They also don't fit very well if what's before you is a 40-foot wide parcel where you're debating whether the armoring should be replaced, or as in the instance where you allowed armoring on a non-developed lot, whether it should be installed in the first place. So the practicality, and that's complicated by the Constitution of the state of California, which requires that when we go out to seek assessments to tax the residents of a particular jurisdiction, they get to vote on whether they want that to happen or not. and the state is not coming and showering billions of dollars on the coast to make that happen. The practicality is not there. So what the working group, or let me speak for myself, my motivation in working on this working group is to make our planning and our project decision-making process much more efficient because we have to, because the relentless rise of sea level is going to require that we do that. And so if we are thinking about what's to happen with the adaptation on a 40-foot wide lot, let me just go, maybe this helps break the conversation. The idea of the neighborhood scale was to open up possibilities for solution by opening up the spatial scale. And to me, the neighborhood, I agree, and it has connotations that don't help, is some piece of geography where the totality of our sea level rise adaptations can produce, I had to write it down because it's a lot of good words, produce the results that's most beneficial, both for the people that are involved and the environment that's involved, get the best possible overall result there, given the existing pattern of development. And I think the existing pattern of development is something obviously you wrestle with all the time, but it's a real fact. And also given the opportunities to improve coastal resources and coastal access. So the concept of neighborhood to me, and I was discussing this with Commissioner Rice at the break, is some scale of our geography, and it will vary from small to large, where we think comprehensively about this, where if we decide that for practical reasons, which local government has to deal with all the time, we have to do something like armoring, that there is a offsetting beneficial option that can occur. And if I could reference what we saw coming from Arcata today, I think that's the best vision of that moving forward that I've seen.
Bruce, thank you. I know we have some more answers from our working group members, but please, Commissioner Cummings and Commissioner Boschko, I see you.
Thank you. And just want to appreciate everybody for being here today and all the input that we've received. I did want to just give a little bit of a pushback on on a comment that was just made around nature-based solutions being expensive, because I do think, and I just want to give some examples, and I'll just give an example from Santa Cruz. Like almost every winter, we have high amounts of woody debris that washes up on our beaches. And so I think this also gets back to this conversation of what do we how do we define a beach? And for some of us, it is this flat, sandy area where people can lay out. And in other instances, it's, sandy habitat mixed with dune habitat. And in many circumstances, had humans not been involved in, kind of being out on these beaches and cleaning these up, that woody debris would accumulate over time, and over time, dunes would accumulate as well. And for certain areas, if we would allow the dune habitat to reestablish itself, that is an example of a nature-based solution that is actually pretty inexpensive, because we're just taking the wood, we're burying it under sand, and over time that sand accumulates more and more, and that then serves as a barrier. And so we actually used that down in Rio Del Mar. Integral Consulting had done a project down there, and that area where they had placed that, log pile and began to rebuild that dune, it didn't wash away in the 2023 storms. And now they're starting to use it outside of the boardwalk. And so I just think we need to get creative around, how do we use what nature's already putting right in front of us to help us defend some of the properties that are ahead of us, rather than just going out and flattening beaches because we think of a beach as being this flat, like sandy space. And so I just wanted to put that out there because I think that, yes, in certain circumstances, it can be really expensive. And then additionally, and this kind of gets back to Commissioner Hart's discussion around habitat, is for many of these areas, we've gone out and we've destroyed the natural habitat. And as a result, when the storms come in, we're negatively impacted. And if we were to restore that natural habitat, that habitat would actually serve as a buffer to help mitigate some of the impacts from the storms that we're going to be experiencing. And so I think it varies, but so that's just the one point I wanted to make. And then I guess getting back to some of the other points, I think, and Commissioner Nodoff brought it up around geography, but I think geology is something that we should be considering when we're thinking about the kind of neighborhood approach, because, you might have people on a granite bluff top versus limestone versus, they're in a marsh flat habitat, and those all are going to require different types of mitigations. And so for the sandy habitat, maybe it's, remove the armoring and allow for the sand to erode, or the sandstone to erode, so then you can, maintain that beach versus, if there's no beach below and it's granite, maybe you do need to armor. I think there's a lot of ways we can think about it. And so within the context of a neighborhood approach, really thinking about it from a geological perspective, and then working along with, USGS and modeling to see under X, Y, and Z circumstance with sea level rise, with storm intensity, when are we going to start seeing failure, and how can we really take that into consideration? So I think those are just a few things I wanted to mention.
Thank you very much. I know Director Huckabridge has more to say about the nature of the problem we're trying to solve, but first is Commissioner Bochco. Please go right ahead.
Thank you so much. Well, this is my fourth. Bruce and I have been doing this for a long, long time. And I must say, I am absolutely thrilled how far you've gotten, because I do remember when the word, we were told, don't even say managed retreat out loud, because people were so upset. And, it was clear why they would be, but unfortunately at that time, we didn't have the facts on the ground that we're seeing every day. What I'd like to address is mostly what my fellow commissioners have already said, but I just want to add a couple thoughts to that. It seems to me that what we're talking about is something that local communities are very used to, which is districts. Within your county or your city, you have these districts. And you might think about that and trying to find the proper name for this, whether it's a geological district or a habitat district or whatever is on the ground. And if that is your first step in planning your LCP, then you kind of know where you're going. Well, this district is a bluff and it's got houses falling in the sea, that's obviously a different district than down the way where you have maybe a beach or a rock revetment that's preventing a beach. These are things I think you're also smart. You're going to figure all that out. I want to really underline what Carol Hart said, Chair Hart said, because she is also brilliant. Habitat. It has to be a part of this. And I think that could go also in the whole concept of a district, because that to me is, I know private property is a big deal to all of us, but that to me is a very big deal. I want to throw out there, because of what Bruce was saying earlier, we are very aware of takings. We're always being threatened by, oh my God, it's a taking. I want to know, why isn't it a reverse taking when the private property owner builds his seawall and my public trust lands, my beach is taken? I think that's something we have to look at. Whether that's ever been tried in a courtroom, I don't know where Louise is, but I don't know. I think the reverse should be equally as true, right? They can't take my land, I can't take theirs. So what happens? I think that's something really important to think about as well. My personal preference would be that in looking at your options in any given area, that we absolutely prioritize in terms of the language of the LCP that nature-based solution is the goal. And I don't mean right away, but in all this talk today of all these new things that are being discovered, like the wood on the beach, 10 years ago, no one would even thought of that. These things are available to us because we do have now the attention of the government. The Inflation Reduction Act didn't exist when Bruce and I started these conversations, so there was no money. But there are opportunities for money now. I'm just saying, stuff like that, you can't predict it, Bruce, unless you're going to be running with Kamala.
No, never. No, and if I could just interject on this, here's what's lacking to my eye, as we look at sea level rise adaptation, is the long-term commitment of revenue source to deal with it. these one-off things, Inflation Reduction Act.
I understand that, but that's not an impossibility anymore. Do you understand what I'm saying? Things are changing so fast that I think we can, let me rephrase that. Let me just say this. I think it would be inappropriate to make money the equal to infeasibility. And I've never liked it. You know, we have other situations in the Coastal Act where, oh, it's just too expensive, so it's not feasible. I don't believe that. What I do believe is you look at all aspects of a given situation, a given, district, and you say, okay, this one is obviously not going to have nature-based solution because it's already a bluff with no beach. It just happened already. But anyway, I really, really think you should prioritize that as the goal and have to rule it out under very specific, and I think this could go on in any LCP up and down the state. Go down the list. Is this possible? Is this possible? Is this possible? Can I finish?
Oh, I thought you were finishing. I'm so sorry. Class.
1 second. I really wanted to say I agree with Commissioner Escalante. Some definitions here I didn't understand, and I'm sure that we can fill those out. I think the Surfrider letter brought up really important issues. I hope we pay really close attention to what they're saying. And finally, and I will be done, the existing development definition. I mean, almost 14 years I've been here, and it's always been this huge question mark. I mean, some of us believe that you just read the language of the law and it's very plain. Existing meant existing when it was written. Okay. If you don't want it to be that, then I suggest, A, somebody gets this through the court system quickly so we can all know what we're doing. Or B, we somehow end up with the legislature in agreeing on what would make sense of what existing means. I mean, to say existing means anything that exists when you hand in your application for a permit, that doesn't make sense. So I really think this is a wonderful meeting. I'm so proud just to be a part of it because I think this is our future. We're talking about the future of our coastline. Oh, and the one other thing is I wanted to also confirm acknowledge what Commissioner Escalante said about the corridors. I think inland access, because we think of beach access as just getting to the beach. This is what we're all fighting for. We're all fighting for the idea that property owners on the beach are not our constituents. I mean, they're your constituents, but I'm saying the Coastal Act's constituents are not the people who own the property. It's the people who need to get to the beach. And I think the only way to do that is to look at corridors and access in a much deeper way. Thank you, I'm done.
Commissioner Hart.
Thanks. Just very quickly, and when it comes to funding, I've been on the Coastal Conservancy Board now as chair, and I've been struck by the hundreds of millions of dollars that are being spent to restore the bay, the Cargill salt ponds. I think that we are underestimating the money that could be available. We have a bond that's on the ballot coming up that provides billions of dollars potentially. What's missing to me is, really identifying within local communities key projects in the coastal zone that are important projects, even if they do cost, significant tens of millions of, without having them identified. If you always stop because you think expense is going to be the problem, then how can you ever reach to accomplish those things? So I just wanted to make that point regarding the Conservancy.
Director, what do you see as some of the challenges we're trying to address?
So before I get to that, I did want to just appreciate the conversation around what is the definition of a neighborhood and some of the suggestions from commissioners. This very much mirrors a lot of the discussion we had at a local government working group. We've gone through those exact discussions. Is it something that's geologic or physical, or is it, and the answer I think we kind of came up with is yes, it's all those things, and it's going to look different for every jurisdiction. And so the idea was to provide flexibility. But I think you're hitting on, we weren't necessarily satisfied with the word neighborhood because of the connotation of houses and people, habitating in a neighborhood, but have yet to come up with a better word. But I think we've heard a couple here. We need to put our thinking caps a little bit back on and take that as a challenge to come up with something that's a little bit more what we're talking about, I think.
Director, can I add a piece to that quickly?
Please.
This is not my answer. I'm relaying a conversation that's going on. In addition to the actual name, perhaps the harder and more important discussion is the criteria that are used to define an area so that they can be applied consistently. So neighborhood as a word has problems. The criteria will be where the rubber hits the road, please.
I also really appreciated the comments and the discussion, and it's the first time I've heard the word of access shed. So thank you, Dr. Lester, for that. I like that concept so much. I think you immediately, as a person who worked in watersheds for so many years, I have a visual of what that means, and I like expanding it to include other resources. It just makes sense, and so appreciate the term, and then thinking of it both as access sheds and corridors. How are we bringing people to the coast effectively? And I think just to go then back to what's not working is part of what we need to do, and I will just steal from what Bruce said, is we need to open up the spatial scale a little bit. We aren't seeing LCPs come through. We have a lot of we get some and project specific, and we've had some really great updates, but we have a lot of LCPs that still have really old policies. And so what that means is if we can't update those to include just the acknowledgement of sea level rise, for example, or a lot of the other policies that you're used to seeing, we end up, there is development out there that I don't think we would be happy with from a resilience standpoint. A lot of times you're not seeing it because the local governments are, they're using their LCPs to approve or deny development based on those old policies. Sometimes it gets appealed to you. But those conversations look really different up and down the coast depending on what LCP is in front of whatever local government. And so I think, again, we got into this space that was very much combative. And I want to acknowledge how difficult it is for our local government folks here to try to bring some of these ideas back to their communities and sell them essentially to these communities who are very afraid of losing their private property or afraid of losing their beach. I mean, it runs the gamut, right? So I think part of what we are trying to achieve here is a way that we can be a united front and be collaborative together to try to pull people in. Like we kind of need to look at this as a challenge that we are all a part of and we all need to move forward together. And so if we can achieve success on some of these hard LCP things, I think we will help bring people along generally. And that's where you get more flowing on funds and other things too. If everybody is sort of committed, like, yeah, this is a huge problem. We're going to lose California's beaches. If we put in too many seawalls in this state, it's done. That kind of connection, I think, is what we need. And I think that's sort of what the problem we're trying to solve. It's like, how do we find a way that we can together show that this is an important problem that we need to solve and convince the public, convince constituents, convince lawmakers and everybody else that we have to get through these hard things. Like, what is the definition of development? What are these things? Because if not, we're screwed, for lack of a better term. So, yeah, a technical term. So, and that's also another way to build the political will, right? To address maybe some of these questions, the legislative solutions or funding that comes down to fund these types of projects. But if, so I think it's kind of a package. And like, I guess that's my answer to what's not working. It's hard to say, well, in this location, we have this bad development, and that's why it's not working. It's sort of, we have this deadlock. We have people fighting each other all the time, and you have people pitted in different camps instead of understanding that, like, all these things are part of it, and if we don't figure out a way through, the entire, like, we're all suffering, and our beaches will be gone. So I guess that's kind of a long-winded way of describing at least what I see as the problem or what we're trying to fix here. But it's hard, but we have made a lot of progress, and hoping, and I guess appreciating too the feedback you've all provided so that we can kind of go in and dig in a little bit more. Where are we going from here? How can we refine this approach? How do we start to build specificity, address some of the definition questions, all those things? I think sounds like from what at least I'm hearing, that's kind of, there is general support for us at, digging into this a little more. but maybe with more of a focus on nature-based solutions, or at least that's written into some of the documentation we have and habitat and things of that nature. So we're hearing all of this, just want that clear too.
Please, Sue.
Thank
Sorry,
you, Bruce. Thank you.
I see
I
a
have tech
commissioner.
support right here next to me. I wanted to address some of the issues around funding because I agree with the points of view that say there's more millions of dollars than there have ever been. And the other part of how do we access that funding? And when you're a small local jurisdiction, you have a small staff. I know the Coastal Commission knows a thing or two about having, not enough staff to do the work. And so going after the dollars, being shovel ready, being ready to implement is really challenging because we don't have the consensus, or at least the grudging agreement. I don't know what to call it. We need to have, I always put it in the category of hearts and minds. We need, and I want to echo something that Cindy Abbott from Pacifica said about visioning. We need to have an opportunity on whatever scale, neighborhood, literally block by block, section of a city by section of a city, the entire city, a vision of where we're going and how long it's going to take to get there. Because this issue of time and space, it's been said before much more eloquently than I can. It goes beyond the term of a council member. It goes beyond the term limits of a council member. It goes beyond, we need to be able to develop a vision for the long term that we continuously work toward, not one that we make a vision that's pretty good for about 4 years or maybe, and then it kind of falls away because there was too much conflict. How do we sustain that over time? And I keep coming back to community conversations. I really don't know any other way because our process in local government working group has been exactly that. It's been that, and it's been a few years. It takes time to work through those. And to me, that's what's going to help us. And that alone, it isn't free. It costs money to do a good job of that. So that's what I'm rolling around in my head, and I'm not sure where to take that exactly, but it's certainly where I think we're going to need to go next in Pacifica.
Thank you so much. Really interesting conversation. I appreciate all the comments, especially these most recent ones. Councilmember Beckmeyer, that yes, we're all going to be gone as this problem continues to unfold. And I'm talking about climate change and sea level rise. And as we as communities and as a society sort of grapple with it, I'm not sure if what I'm going to say is going to be helpful, but I'll add it to the mix. I'm thinking about when the Coastal Act was first, when Prop 20 was passed and then the Coastal Act was developed. And our local jurisdictions, many of them, went through an LCP development process. And the Coastal Act envisioned or saw the science that existed in those days, and our local coastal programs and IPs were developed with bluff setbacks, recognizing that there was a natural bluff erosion process that happened, that bluffs weren't naturally stable, and that there were influences by ocean tides and storms that had impacts on the coast and coastal erosion and beach erosion. And so there were setbacks put in place on private properties to where people could develop. And climate change has exacerbated all those forces and accelerated. I mean, basically that's what is happening. And maybe and to some degree even changing on the shoreline currents and things, so you have different erosion types of patterns. But when those LCPs were developed, and I'm most familiar with mine in Marin County, it envisioned this evolution of the natural environment. And so rules were put in place around where people could develop to account for that. So in terms of new development, I feel like that's what we're doing right now in terms of trying to incorporate sea level rise. And I guess that's one of the issues we have, is that we have old LCPs potentially that don't recognize the current natural forces and need to be updated because they're working with old science, say. And then, so that speaks to sort of the new development. And then there's the existing development, which of course is the elephant in the room that was never an elephant in the room for me. I always thought that existing meant anything that was built before the Coastal Act. And I think that that's going to have to play out. In the meantime, we have these parcel by parcel or project by project development, CDPs coming before us that we're needing to deal with. I do think, and we're seeing it in some of the larger public projects that feel like they're on a larger scale. And I'm thinking about the San Francisco Ocean Beach thing that's going to be coming to us that's really had to incorporate a lot of different infrastructure, public access, beaches. It's incorporated different tools in terms of how it's going to deal with sea level rise. So to me, it makes sense that it does make sense to be looking at a neighborhood. I think is a bad construct because it has a lot of connotations around people, community, and development, and doesn't have that connotation about landform, everything we were just talking about, sort of what exists naturally, as well as public access. So I like the idea of really understanding. Any LCP should understand the dynamics, the different variables at play, and the dynamics of a shoreline, both in terms of environment, social, and otherwise. So to me, that makes a lot of sense, but I don't have a good word for you. And then it feels like what we're seeing with some of the things that are coming before us, where it feels like things have been done right, is that the toolbox of potential solutions is out there, and there's an analysis done as to what is the best tool in the tool, what's available in the toolbox, and what is the best tool to apply here. And I would say you'd apply an IPM approach, an integrated pest management type approach, which you look to see what is the least impactful, or what is the softest touch that's going to achieve the goal. So that's more towards approach. And I think that's happening, but we're forcing it, and it's not necessarily written into LCPs, but I think that's what we're looking for. And I'm wondering if in the local, the government working group, if it might not help to have conversations that differentiate between how are we going to approach this around public infrastructure and public assets, including beaches and including infrastructure, versus private property, and if maybe the conversation couldn't get farther along, at least in that realm, rather than getting stuck on the private development. So that's a suggestion. I think we'll get farther there, and frankly, I think we're going to have more examples of application of different tools, different adaptation techniques, and actually get a sense of how well they're working, and maybe at a larger scale. I don't know if any of that really makes sense. There's a lot here, and there aren't any easy solutions, and we have to keep talking about it. But I'm going to go right back to the beginning. I kind of think the Coastal Act really got it right off the get-go. It saw that nature was going to have impacts, and we had to plan for development around what those impacts were going to be and account for it without having to armor, frankly. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Eckerly.
Thank you. I'll be brief. I really appreciate this conversation and all of the feedback that we've heard today. I support exploration and kind of continued conversation around this. I think the impacts, as we all know, are so consequential, and that means we need to continue to be creative in our approaches. But in that creativity, we have to ground our actions in resource protection and access and resilience for communities and ecosystems. So I think that is our kind of founding principles for all of us sitting here, but I think it's important to keep that really in focus. One point on the question or need for funding, I want to reiterate again, the Ocean Protection Council has a grant program to support exactly these things, including community visioning and planning. We are continuing to iterate and think about how to improve that program. I would welcome the opportunity to talk with our local government representatives on how we can do better to support those needs and to really incentivize this regional approach and planning, and not just defaulting to the least expensive option. So I would love to talk more about that.
Councilmember Friedman.
Thank you. This is a really great discussion, and I appreciate the candor and just the back and forth discussion. Just some comments in general. First is the access shed. It was a term that I came across probably about 6 months ago. With Dr. Lester hosted a coastal access summit down in Ventura County, and many of the people there were not from coastal communities. And it turns out, as part of the discussion, that there is data that shows if you live in an inland community, say even 60, 80 miles away, that a lot of people there, when they come to the coast, they come to the same beach every time. It's not like they're going to a beach here or there. They go to specific beaches, and whole entire neighborhoods from those areas go to one small beach, and they won't even go to a beach that's 2 miles away. So it was just an interesting thing I learned on that concept. So a few things just as my wrap-up comments are, getting back to the question is, are we, it's a commonality we all have, and I think we would all would say yes to the following, that we are better off as a state because of the last 50 years with the Coastal Act and the policies. But the question is, with the challenges and headwinds before us with sea level rise, climate change, do the tools we have now that we've been using, are they adequate for us to meet the challenges? And they're not at this point. There's a lot of good tools, but we need more. We need to have more of those. And that's what this conversation is about, is where do we get the new innovations? But chiefly among them is to make sure that as we develop any new tools, that they address and prevent any unintended consequences that we can foresee. Chiefly among them is what most of the public comment is extended seawalls. So, and then this gets back into the comments that any goals should be habitat-based, nature solution-based should be the goal. I completely concur with that. City of Santa Barbara, my colleague, Member Harmon, we agree with that. We're very, want to protect our beaches and coast. And so the other aspect is I like, as a new starting point for our discussions, the neighborhood has always been problematic in terms of just the name. We haven't been able to come up with another term. I think we've heard that a lot today, so I'm repetitive. I feel like a parrot saying that. But the district, the reference of district is some possibilities that our group can go back and work with, because it allows us to look at a few different things. One is human activity, whether it's coastal access, so you have a coastal district, you could have a housing district, a public infrastructure district, but it also allows, when you get to these political borders of two cities together, that if you weren't from there and you were driving on the street, you wouldn't know that you went from one city to the next. And so when you're talking about districts, it can transcend that. And so that might be a starting point for us to really reframe this. And you can get into the access sheds as well. So I think that for our discussions that we've been having would be very helpful on that. And then the last thing is that the future, I'm pleased that it seems that there is support for us to continue to have these discussions, and the continuation of the Coastal Commission, all of you via your staff working with us as the locals will provide the collaboration, but also get into the flexibility that we need and to continue moving forward. And again, it's really nature-based holistic solutions are the goal. And to put it in another frame, is that when we look at development through the environmental impact, we do environmental impact reports. Very rarely do you look at one parcel, especially when you're looking at some that has a potential to be redeveloped? Because the impacts would be so insignificant, it would never trigger what we all know would happen. So if you have one parcel, it's not going to do anything. But if we know that 50 more parcels would be developed, we're required by statutes to look at it holistically and say, if you do this, everybody else is. So then you're going to have the air impacts, the water impacts, all these different impacts. If you flip it around and you say, well, why don't we look at it from proper resource management and opportunities for nature-based solutions, and you're looking at it instead of what are the impacts, you're looking at what are the benefits. That is the whole goal of the neighborhood district approach. And it's just a way of flipping it on its head and saying, that's where the tools need to be and that's where we could go. And I think most of the comments I've heard are supportive of that, but we have to be very careful and cognizant of the issues that the public raised. And I'm very thankful that you all did, because it forces us to go back and do our job. So thank you.
Please, Commissioner Escalante.
That's what happens when you go first and you have a lot of thoughts afterwards. So sorry to come back, and I'll wrap up quickly. I was thinking of watershed, the word watershed, and this sort of maybe as we're talking about evolving as society, we might need a new word. I'll propose coastal shed, but something like it at the English majors may try to, but that concept, kind of the same concept of watershed, the coastal, that sort of geographical and also, community outlook and setting of parameters around it. Now, the last thing I wanted to say sort of was about to deal with some of the comments from our local officials is culture. And I think as a climate, advocate, and this has been the big issue, right? How do we move culture fast enough to be able to adapt and save as much life and property as we can in the face of catastrophic climate change? So, of course, some of the biggest leaders and influencers of culture in the United States have interest in the California coastal zone from all the industries and sectors. So this is a kind of a moment not just to invite all of California to really think about this in a more comprehensive way, but especially those folks with enormous cultural power to be able to advance these conversations. And for example, Baywatch is coming back, and I keep on saying this. Baywatch is coming back. I think we should all have a conversation with the producers of Baywatch and make sure that the protection of the Coastal Act and all of its issues are part of their drama. I think that is, very much a coastal thing, but not just Baywatch. Anybody who wants to, profit from the cultural impacts of our beaches, should take some of this burden, some of this responsibility to protect it for the long term. So I'll wrap up. Thank you.
Commissioner Wilson, and then I'll work to wrap up our discussion, please.
I'll work to do that too. Thanks. I just want to thank everybody, but I want to take note that 6 of us commissioners up here are local government representatives. So with jurisdiction and communities that are impacted by these issues. So it's not, we have some representation on this commission that, and including the city of Arcata is in my district, and these issues are, and that's the wastewater treatment plant that I use, and so and that community. So I want to, it's we have 140,000 visitors a year that come visit our wastewater treatment plant, so it's very special. And so everyone should go. But what I'm trying to get at is, first of all, you can count me in as yes in moving this forward. So that, I just want to get that out the door. And then I feel that take some responsibility that we, because we talked about a year ago this neighborhood where it didn't work, and then we just sort of went on and did other things. So I apologize with the distraction to us all today. I promise we'll have something by next year that this will not be a distraction to talk about. But there was this district concept that came up, and we have, through legislation, was created the climate resilient districts construct, which is which is to be a financial tool. And we've actually seen a project come before us to propose that in terms of and which is a neighborhood scale. And again, we'll be using that word very loosely here, adaptation tool to create the the financial means to have these sort of responses, because part of this has always been financial. And I have to push back a little bit on my commissioners and say that their financial doesn't matter. Those of us who are in local government and really can feel the heat from that a little bit. Sorry for this, my way that I talk through all of these things, my stream of consciousness, as it were. But it is important to understand that there is a lot of embedded capital, especially when we're talking about public infrastructure, that we need to take into account. And I think David Loya's discussion today sort of really spoke to that very directly, where he said, here's the embedded capital that we need to transition out of, and it's not something we can do just in one day and do it tomorrow, so we really have to take that into account. That's different than a house-by-house basis, and I will say the other thing that's very different about that discussion for Arcata versus, say, Santa Cruz or other places is that it's a bay and estuary. So the dynamic of that is extremely different, and we need to disassociate. They're just very, very different things in the way we look at that. So I want to make sure that that's understood in this process. My last question, and this is for Kate, and sorry, I'm going to ask you this question, which is, when LCPs break down, which is what's sort of happening, if it really breaks down, what's the result? And this is what we're trying to avoid. This is like the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have updated LCPs, and we have breakdown of communication often between local governments and our staff. So I think that those are some of the potential results. But what we end up with are these old policies based on old science and things of that nature that govern the way development is contemplated in a particular local government. And I think we end up then in our same old habits and not thinking about resilience and sea level rise. And it's more reaction. We have a lot of we're back in that reactive position. And I say we being the collective we, local governments and the state, we're forced to react as opposed to trying to be proactive. So I guess that would be my take on it.
So really the point of this is to create a process that invite local jurisdictions in to get into this. And I did hear a little bit of angst around at least one jurisdiction today in that. And I don't want to, what I don't want to have is like the experience of one jurisdiction sort of necessarily create what happens with all of the jurisdictions that we're dealing with in this. As I've said before, there's just such a variety, and some will be more challenging than others. It's just the way that it is and will be. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't, I think, move forward with this concept, whether it's a neighborhood, a district, or a shed of some kind. I think this is a valuable effort, and this is also my fourth meeting, fourth year of doing this, so I'm hoping to not have to do it forever.
Thank you. We are at time. Can I do something to close us in the last 20 seconds here? The first is I would just want to do a temperature. Commissioner Uranga, pardon me, I missed you. Please.
Thank you.
Pardon.
I exist. I am, therefore I am here. No. Oh, sorry. I was waiting for a while. I had it up and then brought it down. Whatever. But as an individual, as it was brought up before, I'm term limited. This will probably be one of my last opportunities to participate in this workshop. And I've been here since the beginning, since 2015. So a lot of great conversation, a lot of great ideas. And you've been circling around an important word for me, an important concept for me. And that's why we have to approach this issue holistically. Everything comes into play, everything. And we've been sort of looking at it from silos, this and this and this and that and that. But we need to bring it all together into one piece. And one thing I brought before a long time ago was we were talking about some issues, and we were looking at the letter of the law or the spirit of the law. Same here, same concept. Are we looking at the letter of the guidelines or the spirit of the guidelines? What are our interests in these guidelines? Why do we need them? Why do we want them? And then use that holistic approach to come up with some solutions that'll be meaningful, that'll address the various jurisdictions, neighborhoods, what are their interests. That's what we have to look at. So I might not be here when we hold another workshop, but I just thought I want to bring that up for consideration. That, excuse me, I'm beginning to lose my voice, but bring it out in the sense that, you know, when we look at anything, we need to look at it as a whole. And I hope that this commission, as great as it is, keeps the spirit up and foremost, and not always rely on the letter of the regulation or the letter of the law, but keep the spirit up. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you very much. Is there general support to continue exploring this idea? Are you interested in one observation on attention I see that will be critical in addressing to make the next steps, just a procedural? In all of these discussions, regional solutions, earlier discussions this year on OPC guidance, SB 272, I hear a built-in tension that we will continue to need to deal with. I hear local government saying, we need a signal that shows us some of the things that might enjoy support because it's expensive and risky for us to experiment. It takes money and time for us to go down the road to do these things, and we need to be very careful of the political capital we use to even have these discussions. And we back up and change, it's very difficult. So we need a signal from the commission to do things. And on the other side, I hear, and it is our job to protect the Coastal Act. We can't provide any promises in advance. This is a case-by-case thing, and in order to honor the Coastal Act and to do it right and to protect public resources, we can't issue promises and guarantees in advance. That's a built-in tension that will not go away. It's a good tension, it's important. And to achieve solutions on this front, everybody's gonna have to stretch. And that's what's happening in this room today. That's actually what's going on here. As commission staff and commissioners looking forward at what could be possible and to identify the key challenges, and local governments exhibiting leadership and courage, which they already are. They're doing it every day. And so that's what this discussion has been today. Thank you very much for your time. Everybody that is on the working group, these are extra duties for them, and they're putting this time, except for the coastal staff who, when it comes to chopping wood and carrying water, it all falls on them. And thank you very much for your time today and on these discussions. Chair, back to you.
Thanks so much, and I just want to appreciate you, Kaylin, for your involvement in this. Every single person that has worked with you has said how much you've brought to this process, and so I would just want to appreciate you, and again, the local government working group. It's a lot to come from as far as Arcata, from all over the state. So thank you so much, and thank you to our staff. Just super valuable, and you really identified the tension. So we'll look forward to future discussions, and I believe that completes our agenda for today. I want to thank everyone, and we will see many of you tomorrow.